Checking 1, 2, 3, 4. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Auto check 1, 2. Okay. So yeah. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Play. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2, 3.
everybody doing?
Hi, how are you? Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
I think we'll get started. Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to remember the lives lost 18 years ago on September 11th. Many of us here on the committee were there when this happened. I remember having breakfast in the Capitol when the first plane hit the tower, which I didn't know at the time. And when I got back to my office and saw my staff all watching the television sets is when the second plane hit, and we just knew something terrible had happened. And it seems like it couldn't have been 18 years ago, but it was. And I just think we want to remember all the sacrifices that got made by our police and firemen, all our first responders that ran towards that building. Many of them aren't with us today from illnesses that they contracted being down there at that site. And also remember that evening that we all stood on the steps of the Capitol, Democrats and Republicans locking arms and singing God Bless America. I remember that very vividly, too. We probably could use a little bit more of that these days in this country of coming together as Americans. I just asked that maybe we just take a brief couple seconds to, for a moment of silence, just to reflect on 9/11 18 years ago and all the people that passed. Thank you. Well, I want to welcome everyone to our first hearing since our August recess. Today, our hearing is focusing on legislating to connect America, improving our nation's broadband maps. This subcommittee will consider 5 pieces of legislation that I believe can help address serious problems with the way the FCC currently collects broadband deployment data. This is an often discussed topic here in Congress, and the lack of clear data has often been a sore spot for many of us here on the committee. However, the FCC, in coordination with industry stakeholders, has been making significant strides to improve the quality of some of these maps, and the bills before the committee today build on those efforts. Accurate maps of who does and who doesn't have access to broadband are a critical first step in closing the digital divide. We can't hope to solve this problem if we don't know the scope of the problem and where to put our resources. First, we have H.R. 4229, the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability Act, introduced by Representative Loebsack and Ranking Member Latta. This bill would dramatically improve the FCC broadband maps by requiring the FCC to collect and disseminate far more granular broadband data for both fixed and mobile services. The bill would also allow the FCC to use crowdsourced data to help verify and supplement carrier-provided data. Second, we have H.R. 4128, the Map Improvement Act of 2019, introduced by Representatives Lujan, Bilirakis, and myself. It would standardize the methodology used for collecting and verifying coverage data provided by providers. It would also establish a new office within the FCC to serve as a central coordinator for the Commission's mapping efforts. Third, we have H.R. 4227, the Mapping Accuracy Promotes Services Act, introduced by Representatives McEachin, Long, Loebsack, and Latta. This bill would make it unlawful for a person to submit inaccurate broadband coverage data to the FCC. Fourth, we have H.R. 2643, the Broadband Mapping After Public Scrutiny Act of 2019, which has been introduced by Ranking Member Latta and my good friend Mr. Welsh. This bill would create a challenge process at the FCC for fixed and mobile broadband coverage data and allow private entities as well as state, local, and tribal government entities to verify coverage data submitted to the FCC. And finally, we will consider H.R. 3162, the Broadband Data Improvement Act of 2019, introduced by Representatives McMorris-Rogers and Representative O'Halloran. This bill would update the FCC's mapping process, establish a public challenge process, and require federal agencies to use the newly created broadband maps to determine the extent and availability of broadband in the United States. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses and the discussion about this important legislation, and at this time I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Congressman Loebsack.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Chairman Pallone, Ranking Members Walden and Latta for holding this legislative hearing today. And thank you, Chairman Doyle, for giving me some of your time. There is a lot of great stuff in the Broadband Development Accuracy and Technological Availability Act, or Broadband Data Act, and we'll be discussing that shortly. But I would first like to extend an extra special thanks to Ranking Member Latta for working with me to introduce the Broadband Data Act. I've long been an advocate for better maps and the needs of rural America, and I don't know that I could have had a better ally, quite honestly, than my friend from Ohio. Further, I thank Ranking Member Latta for agreeing to continue working with me on this bill as we look forward to an eventual subcommittee markup. Hopefully that'll happen sooner rather than later. We've had some great conversations with stakeholders, many of whom are represented on the panel today or in the audience, and I believe there's still some potential for some improvements between now and the markup. And just quickly, some of the things that we might continue to work on: creating additional clarity that this bill will keep data publicly available, looking at the addition of an authorization of funding, studying the use of USF funds for administrative costs, exploring a GAO study or ongoing review process for what sources of information are informing the fabric, and considering how we ensure we're not burdening small businesses. I'm very proud of the bill that Representative Latta and I introduced and we'll be talking about today, and I think we have a bill that is ready for markup and passage on the House floor, but there might be some room for improvement, and I am willing to work with Congressman Latta going forward, and with that, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes my friend, Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could also, before my time begins, I'd like to thank you for your very sincere words on remembering 9/11. I think everyone in this room can remember where they were that day, and the impact that it's had on this nation. And I totally agree with you that the country came together that day. I was in the Ohio legislature at the time, but I appreciate your words, and we have to always remember what happened on that day. So thank you. I'd like to welcome you to today's committee legislative hearing on potential solutions to accurately map broadband availability in rural America. I thank our witnesses for joining us and providing their thoughts on this issue. Extending the reach of broadband in rural Ohio and across America is critical to ensure everyone can participate in the digital economy. Since passage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, the private sector has invested roughly $1.7 trillion in their broadband networks. We should acknowledge this investment in rural deployment, ensure that government-supported solutions complement private capital instead of competing with it. This has become increasingly important, with some proposals calling for as much as $150 billion in government funding to publicly own and operate networks nationwide. Today's legislative hearing features several bills introduced by committee members who deeply understand the lack of connectivity across their districts. Our constituents tell us when they don't have service, and it's through their voices that I've heard and worked with my colleagues on two of the bipartisan bills that will be discussed today. The Broadband Maps Act, which I introduced with my very good friend, the gentleman from Vermont, would help to verify reported data through a public challenge process. And the Broadband Data Act, which I've developed with my good friend, the very good friend, the gentleman from Iowa, would take a comprehensive approach to fixing our nation's maps. I believe that these bills will help build on the success of our previous partnership to deploy broadband to rural farms, lands through the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act. As we look to the FCC's next round of universal service funding, it is vital that we work in a bipartisan manner to ensure that there is a verified, accurate, and granular foundation upon which we make these funding decisions. Congress has an important oversight role to play in ensuring that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. With limited federal dollars to go around, we simply cannot afford to misidentify areas that served which are truly unserved. Only with accurate and granular data will we begin to close the last frontier of the digital divide. It is also critical that a robust, user-friendly challenge process is in place to appropriately dispute potential inaccuracies within the coverage maps. We must and have to get the maps right, and in creating a pathway for the FCC to consider additional broadband data will help achieve that goal. As we move toward committee markups, I anticipate continuing discussions with my friends across the aisle on several outstanding issues, such as striking the right balance between protecting competitive, sensitive information while providing transparency to consumers, ensuring that we can leverage data the best we can across the federal government, and addressing the cost of the fabric and ongoing review of the fabric's reach and effectiveness, and finally examining unintended impacts of certain requirements on small businesses. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and I'm committed to working with my colleagues on these issues through regular order. And at this time, I'd like to yield the rest of my time to my good friend, the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you for yielding, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here, and I'm happy to see that the subcommittee is prioritizing the need to develop accurate broadband maps. For rural communities such as Missouri's 7th Congressional District, access to broadband is as scarce as hen's teeth. I think we can all agree that mapping, graphically displaying where broadband is and is not available at certain speeds is a critical tool in closing the digital divide. As we move forward, I believe it is important that the broadband mapping update be paired with appropriate enforcement measures to ensure that provider submissions are complete and accurate, which is why I'm working with my colleagues on H.R. 4227 and the MAPS Act. In closing, I'd like to thank Representatives Dave Loebsack of Iowa, the Telecom Ranking Member Bob Latta, and Donald McEachin, Virginia, for their work on both the Broadband Data Act and MAPS Act, and I'm committed to working together toward the subcommittee markup and sticking the landing on this important topic. I yield back.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. This year, our committee has focused on improving telecommunications services for consumers. In July, the House overwhelmingly passed the bipartisan Stopping Bad Robocalls Act, and earlier this year, the House passed legislation that restores a free and open Internet by reinstating net neutrality. And now this subcommittee continues its work on a range of pro-consumer issues, including broadband deployment, spectrum policy, supply chain security, and more. Broadband mapping is a central component in each of these discussions. Without good maps, we can't correctly determine how we should target funding for broadband access and adoption in rural and urban areas. Without good maps, we don't have enough detail to assess competition or review mergers. And without good maps, we don't have a proper view of whether the FCC is appropriately using its authority to benefit consumers. It's not an exaggeration, in my opinion, to say this FCC's terrible broadband data is its Achilles heel. And the statistics show just how bad this problem is. Free Press recently discovered that one carrier alone was overstating its deployment by 2.2 million consumers, throwing off the FCC's entire estimate of unserved Americans. And CostQuest discovered as part of its state pilot program that as many as 38% of households in the study area might be unserved, but the FCC may count them as served. I think it's a huge problem. Fortunately, there is bipartisan agreement on the subcommittee that the FCC's bad maps need to be fixed. Last year, Representative Lopsack's Rural Wireless Access Act was signed into law, which aimed at fixing the FCC's wireless data. Unfortunately, the FCC hasn't yet taken the action required by law due to the ongoing investigation into carriers intentionally submitting bad data as part of the Mobility Fund 2 proceeding. So it's clear that despite our past action, more work needs to be done. And I thank the many members who have worked hard to solve this problem. I have 3 minutes. I'd like to yield, basically split it if I could, between Representative Lujan and Representative O'Halloran, and I yield a minute and a half now to Representative Lujan, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the chairman and to the ranking members. When it comes to broadband access, according to the FCC, more than 21 million Americans lack access to high-speed fixed broadband. We know that's because of no connectivity or unaffordability. And as the chairman pointed out, wireless maps are also not accurate. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, they're misleading. Because of the problems with how broadband data is collected and mapped, no one really knows what the number is. The problem, most likely, is significantly worse. This is also a life and death issue. Ashlyn Mike was an 11-year-old Navajo girl who was kidnapped, raped, and murdered in 2016. When Ashley went missing, the Amber Alert systems didn't work and there was no connectivity. Mr. Chairman, we have to act. And I thank Chairman Doyle and Congressman Bill Rockus for partnering with me on the MAP Improvement Act, and I thank my colleagues for their related efforts, and I yield back.
I yield the rest of my time to Mr. O'Halloran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, this committee takes an important step towards helping rural America connect to the internet. According to the FCC, only 40% of rural Arizona is currently connected in the home at FCC standard speeds. And even this data point likely overstates broadband coverage due to the census block reporting regime. Working together, I know this committee can right this wrong. The legislation before us today, including my and Representative Rogers' bipartisan bill, the Broadband Data Improvement Act, takes important steps to improve how the FCC and federal agencies identify where broadband coverage exists and where it does not. Just last month, the FCC adopted concepts from this bill to move away from census block reporting and instead ask the internet providers to report shapefiles of their current coverage offerings. There's still more work to be done, and I'm pleased to see the bills before us today continue to move us towards making the national broadband map as accurate as possible. Mr. Chairman, I'm excited to work in a bipartisan manner on this important issue, and collectively I know we can achieve our mutual goal, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, and thanks to all our witnesses for being here. Some familiar faces back at the table. We appreciate your guidance and counsel on these matters. I want to thank my colleague from California, Ms. Eshu. We worked a lot on these issues going back over a number of years, and thank you for your leadership. And we're still not there, but we're working at it. It's obviously an issue I've cared about a lot over the last couple of decades, and some of my friends will remember when the stimulus bill was being voted through this committee, I pled, begged, and even had an amendment to do the mapping before the money went out, and unfortunately we came up a few votes short on that. But maybe today we'll begin this process, because the money needs to go where it's needed and not overbuild and serve these markets that claim on the maps that are already served, but yet they aren't. And so while the incentives have expanded, broadband access and made communicating and participating in the 21st century economy easier than ever before, much work remains to connect all Americans to high-speed internet broadband. I want to use an example, Weston, Oregon, which is in eastern Oregon, in my district. The mayor, Jennifer Spurgeon, describes their internet service as being dial-up, just without the modem noise. All right, and she told Chairman Pai that when he was out a year or so ago, and I thought it was a pretty good line. They frequently experience, obviously, sub-megabit speeds, sub-megabit. So you can imagine how surprised they were when the FCC's map said they had 100 megabit service. And so they were a little surprised because they, it's dial-up without the modem noise. As chairman of this committee, we worked in a bipartisan fashion last Congress, as many of you will recall, to enact legislation to promote rural broadband, and I'm hopeful we can build on that same spirit of bipartisanship. We included provisions in the Rayburn Act to improve the methodology for the collection of mobile service coverage, to streamline access to easements and rights-of-way, and lease requests for deploying communications equipment on federal property. Just for the record, my district's over 50% federal land, so trying to do anything out there can be very time-consuming, costly, and burdensome. And we wanted to improve efficiency of spectrum allocation. So as we continue our oversight of Rayburn's Act, as well as our efforts to spur broadband deployment in rural America, we must also ensure the Universal Service Program is efficiently and effectively reaching truly unserved parts of America. So I applaud Chairman Pai for his leadership on this front, proposing a Rural Digital Opportunity Fund using cost-efficient reverse auctions to better allocate limited financial support from the feds. At the same time, we must ensure the FCC is relying on accurate and sufficiently granular information when making these decisions. There are areas that we all know are unserved. That's pretty obvious. And then, of course, we know of the underserved areas, but what we really need are really good maps that show us for sure. The Senate's already moved a consensus bill through their committee to address this issue, which I believe represents an interesting path. The legislation before us today rightly underscores the importance of this issue and the attention it has earned among members of the committee. There are a number of issues with which Republicans are committed to working on with our counterparts, such as how we're going to provide funding, how to balance publicly available information, and how to improve data sources, and how we can best leverage the data to the greatest extent possible across the federal government. Other members have also put forward bills to address rural broadband challenges, and these proposals deserve consideration as well, and I expect we'll hear about some of those other bills today. So again, Mr. Chairman, thanks for your leadership on this. Thanks for holding this hearing today, and we look forward to working in a good bipartisan spirit to connect America and to have maps that show the truth. So we're all about facts and truth here, so let's get her done. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and he yields back. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members have written open statements will be made part of the record. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Shirley Bloomfield, Chief Executive Officer, NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Mr. James Assay, Executive Vice President, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Mr. Grant Spellmeyer, Vice President, Federal Affairs and Public Policy, U.S. Cellular. Ms. Dana Floberg, Policy Manager, Free Press and Free Press Action. Mr. Jonathan Spalter, President and CEO of the U.S. Telecom Association. And Mr. James Stegman, President and CEO of CostQuest Associates. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. But before we begin, I would like to explain our lighting system. The light in front of you will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. It will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. And please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time expires. And with that, Ms. Bloomfield, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Mr. Walden, and members of the subcommittee. It is so terrific that you all are gathered here today, coming back from recess, to talk about something so important like broadband mapping and the legislation you have that's being considered by the subcommittee. I'm Shirley Bloomfield, CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. I have 850 community-based providers across the country in 46 states that really serve the most sparsely populated parts of our nation. A major challenge associated with making informed policy and investment decisions regarding the deployment of broadband in these rural sparse areas is whether there is or is not service already, which is why the hearing is so important today. But as it stands today, as you've noted, the FCC maintains the most accurate maps available for most areas, but these mapping efforts are still frustratingly inconsistent and unreliable. We find it's not unusual. The conditions that are actually on the ground look very different from what appears on a national map. And we know that the current FCC maps miss the mark because they show an entire census area served when even it's just one location in the block that is served, meaning that the entire census block becomes ineligible for support funding. This false positive can mean a single customer can result in unserved customers miles away looking served on a map. In other words, perhaps the most important significant problem we have is granularity. Just last month, the FCC did adopt an order that will move away from the overly broad use of census blocks for reporting broadband coverage, and instead is now going to require providers to submit shapefiles. And that will actually be a good step forward. At the same time, the FCC agrees with NTCA that we should not stop at shapefiles alone, but we should continue to move forward towards a uniform national data set on top of which carriers can report broadband availability to ensure that this data can ultimately translate to which locations in our country are served or are not. This movement offers great promise in getting more granular maps, but it's really essential to remember that granularity and accuracy are not the same thing. In fact, there are a few key steps that must be taken to promote accuracy separate and apart from granularity. First, we've got to standardize reporting. We've got to make sure that everybody reports on an apples-to-apples basis. That's really critical. Specific technical standards should be established, and we must ensure that providers are not making unreasonable or unrealistic assumptions about the capacities that they actually have. We simply cannot rely on people reporting advertised speeds across a wide swath of rural America to be considered sufficient. In addition to tracking speeds, NTCA submits that the FCC should require reports specifically on the latency and the usage limits applicable to broadband services. Latency and usage limits can play a really critical role in the consumer experience, particularly when you're doing something really important like telemedicine or distance learning, and it would be useful and not an incrementally difficult database to gather. But even if you do standardization up front to improve the mapping inputs, all of that data in question still becomes self-reported. It's self-reported data, so therefore you're going to have a back-end validation process as well to ensure that the process actually has integrity. So one of these validation processes could be crowdsourcing, which allows users to actually report what they're experiencing on the ground. But crowdsourced data must be implemented thoughtfully so that it provides value and detects noteworthy trends rather than creating confusion or burdens. Think of a heat map and what that data tells you. Another and perhaps more critical validation that the Commission could utilize would be a robust challenge process anytime that it's preparing to make significant funding or other policy decisions. A challenge process would enable providers and policymakers to do one last sanity check on the accuracy of the map before decisions are actually reached. A lot of broadband deployment has taken place since the most current map which is out there, which is in 2017. And we want to make sure that we're not doing overbuilding using federal support because that's not the best use of limited resources. Improve the maps on the front end, validate on the back end. American consumers deserve the integrity of that process. Turning specifically to the role that Congress and this committee can play, the legislation that you've got under consideration, we applaud the careful attention that Representative Loebsack and Latta have placed in looking at a couple of things. First, making immediate granularity improvements in the form of shapefiles, very critical. Second, moving towards a more granular location fabric in the future so we can really get a clearer picture. And third, calling explicitly for standard development and challenge processes to improve the data collection on both the front end and the back end. So due in large part to the leadership of this committee and the subcommittee, small broadband providers like those in NTCA's membership have really made great strides in reducing the digital divide. But the job is far from done, and you know that. We've got to make sure that we can use these maps to really figure out where broadband is lacking and sustain broadband where it actually exists today. So on behalf of NTCA and all the members that we represent, we thank you sincerely for this hearing.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Assey for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, members of the subcommittee. My name is James Assey, and I'm the Executive Vice President of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. NCTA's members include the nation's largest providers of high-speed Internet access, as well as small ISPs serving some of the most rural parts of the country. We welcome today's hearing focused on several bills to improve broadband mapping and look forward to working with you on these issues. Over the last 2 decades, our broadband maps have helped chart the rapid growth and expansion of Internet technology. Indeed, Following hundreds of billions of dollars invested by the cable industry and other ISPs, high-speed internet service has rapidly expanded to reach over 90% of American households. Yet despite such success, there are still many places today where broadband service is not available, and likely may not be without some form of government support. Ideally, data from our broadband maps would help us identify these coverage gaps, but regrettably, while the tools currently used offer some assistance in highlighting unserved areas, our system at present is too crude to fully perform this role with desired precision. This is because the FCC's map today relies on information submitted on Form 477 that requires providers to report deployment data at a census block level. While such an approach helps us identify census blocks that are wholly unserved, it also leads to some admitted mistakes, as the methodology counts an entire census block as served, even if just a single household in the block has access. Thankfully, we can improve this process. Indeed, the FCC has recently taken significant steps in this direction, adopting a proposal suggested by NCTA that will require providers to submit polygon shapefiles or coverage maps that more precisely reflect the areas where service can be offered in the normal course of business. Importantly, these rules will also permit further refinement through public, crowdsourced feedback that will promote a more accurate picture of broadband availability. As the committee considers mapping legislation, we encourage it to build on what the FCC has done and refrain from actions that might delay the swift implementation of these improvements. Consistent with this belief, we commend Congressman Loebsack, Ranking Member Latta, as well as Congresswoman McMorris-Rogers and O'Halloran for their respective efforts on the Broadband Data Act and the Broadband Data Improvement Act. Each of these bills would ratify the FCC's reliance on more granular shapefile submissions, secure a more robust validation and challenge process, and improve coordination among federal agencies to track broadband funding awards. Beyond the clear benefits of shapefile reporting, we note that some providers have suggested that the FCC create other tools to complement an improved map of served and unserved areas. Unlike shapefiles, the location fabric tool suggested by U.S. Telecom focuses not on the more granular identification of unserved areas, but rather on determining the precise location of serviceable buildings within unserved areas. Admittedly, such data could be helpful to bidding parties in sizing the potential cost of serving unserved areas, but it also raises a number of thorny implementation questions that deserve to be fully explored on the public record. Indeed, the FCC's pending further rulemaking tees up many of these issues for consideration and offers a perfect venue for parties to test private claims and consider the marginal costs and benefits of creating a new location tool. Finally, as we work to improve the accuracy of maps identifying unserved areas, a process that has already taken 2 years at the FCC, we should avoid getting sidetracked by attempts to insert extraneous data points into the consideration of whether broadband service is or is not available in a particular area. The FCC already collects a wealth of data from broadband providers, and each type of data has value, but attempts to graft new data requests onto mechanisms designed to address broadband availability would only muddy the waters, increase costs, and could delay funding to unserved areas. Instead, we encourage you to appreciate the relevance of specific data to its specific context so as to help identify the signal from the noise and keep improvements moving forward as cleanly and efficiently as possible. At the end of the day, we know that no map will be perfect and that every map is only a snapshot of a world where conditions constantly change. But with common purpose and humility, we can work together to meaningfully improve the accuracy of our current maps in ways that are practical and advance our national interests in bringing the benefits of broadband to all. Thank you for this opportunity and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Spellmeyer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on broadband mapping. Just for the benefit of the members assembled here today, I'm the wireless witness. I'm going to talk about the wireless side of the mapping. Most of my colleagues here at the table are going to be speaking, exclusively to the wireline side, and I want to try to avoid a little bit of confusion over some of the nomenclature that you'll hear. With that said, U.S. Cellular fully supports legislative efforts to improve broadband mapping, including all of the bills before this committee today. As you well know, this is not the first congressional hearing on the topic of broadband mapping. Thanks to this committee's continuing oversight efforts, it is now universally accepted that the FCC's maps overstated coverage in rural areas, sometimes significantly. U.S. Cellular operates in 21 states across America, including many of those represented on this committee. Much of our business involves finding ways to provide service in small towns and on rural roads, areas where population density, economic investment, and income levels are often well below urban areas. We are constantly thinking about ways to address the economics of providing vital broadband services to those areas. Accurately mapping mobile broadband coverage is difficult because there are many factors such as terrain, foliage, spectrum, and equipment deployed that affect how far a radio signal travels and the signal quality a consumer actually experiences on the ground. We believe the primary issue with the FCC's one-time data collection for wireless is that some of the key standards adopted were inconsistent with how carriers actually design and operate their networks. For U.S. Cellular, the Mobility Fund 2 challenge process was an all but impossible task. Our challenges are documented in a YouTube video that's referenced in my written testimony. I've also attached to my written testimony example maps demonstrating the abysmal results we found during drive testing across this country. My company invested over $2 million to bring those challenges. We exhausted that budget. We ran out of time. We succeeded in testing only a small fraction of the areas that we believed to be inaccurate. To its credit, the FCC heard the widespread complaints, and late last year, they thankfully suspended that challenge process to review carrier submissions and to consider next steps. We are at a critical moment in time. Everyone agrees that the maps are not good enough to conduct an auction. The Broadband Data Act will significantly improve broadband mapping for mobile services by mandating standards that reflect how wireless carriers actually engineer their networks today in rural America. For example, the FCC's one-time data collection used a cell edge probability of 80% and a cell loading factor of 30%. Consistent with how we actually engineer our networks today, this legislation would properly direct the use of stronger factors, 90% at the cell edge probability and a 50% cell loading factor, reflective of how busy the network actually is in a rural area. By passing this legislation, Congress will also significantly improve the challenge process. For a challenge process to be effective, the areas of controversy should be small so that the task of bringing challenges is actually manageable for carriers and for the American public. And so that people believe that actually taking the time to participate is worthwhile. In closing, we must get this right because 10 years worth of federal universal service funding is riding on this map. In the fixed broadband world, that's over $20 billion. In the mobile broadband world, it's another $4.5 billion. Every study indicates that it's going to take significantly more than $25 billion to achieve high-quality fixed and mobile broadband throughout our nation. And that doesn't even begin to account for the costs of rolling out 5G. We can't afford to waste even a single dollar. This committee should adopt the Broadband Data Act and the related legislation before it today so that we can get on with the task at hand. Step one is fixing the maps, and we begin that process here today. Step two is even more significant. That's actually filling in those maps. That's a broader challenge, and we look forward to working with the committee on that next. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Floberg, you have 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Members Latta and Walden, and Subcommittee members, thank you for inviting me to testify. I'm here today representing Free Press Action, a nonpartisan nonprofit with 1.4 million members. Every community deserves the benefits of a robust, affordable broadband connection, and better broadband maps are part of getting there, yet they aren't all we need to close the digital divide. We support H.R. 4229, the Broadband Data Act, and H.R. 4227, the MAPS Act, which improve the FCC's National Broadband Map and the underlying Form 477 data by making it more granular. There are indeed opportunities to improve that data, though the existing errors on wired broadband may be significantly smaller than some stakeholders fear. In Virginia and Missouri, CostQuest pilot found that a few 100,000 additional households might be unserved at what the FCC defines as broadband speed. If we extrapolate that nationwide, that could mean potentially 8 to 19 million additional unserved people. That is certainly an issue worth fixing, but the number is far lower than some have speculated. Still, there are some key areas where wired deployment data could be improved. Mobile maps, on the other hand, seem to deserve all the criticism they get. Accurately assessing how a signal will propagate presents unique challenges that can lead to wildly overstated wireless maps. We are optimistic about this legislation's proposals to improve the granularity and accuracy of both mobile and wired deployment data. As we improve our broadband maps, however, we must not sacrifice transparency. Both Congress and the Commission have long recognized the value of ensuring public availability of not just our broadband maps, but also the underlying data. Free Press and others have made extensive use of this data, recently shining a light on massive overreporting by a single small ISP. This illustrates the value of keeping deployment information publicly available. And for a new challenge process to have any true corrective power, outside parties must have access to this data. The Broadband Data Act goes a long way towards this goal, though we would welcome amendments to clarify that deployment data should not be considered confidential. But improving the accuracy of broadband deployment maps should not be the sole preoccupation of this subcommittee. At their best, maps are useful because they help us get where we're going. The National Broadband Map is meant to chart a course for policymakers to close the digital divide. Federal policy here has centered around people who can't subscribe to broadband because it's not available where they live. But the divide actually extends far beyond these completely unserved communities. Millions more people live in an area where broadband at the FCC's speed threshold is already deployed, yet they can't afford to subscribe. In fact, only 42% of households making less than $20,000 a year subscribe to wired home internet, compared to 83% of households with incomes above $100,000. So even if these bills resulted in completely error-free maps, and even if those maps enabled complete national broadband deployment, the digital divide would persist. When it comes to broadband dreams, if you build it, they will come, just isn't true. It's more like, if you build it, they will come, but only if they can afford to pay the price. When families are forced to forgo necessities like diapers and food so they can afford to keep paying their internet bill, when students are forced to research and write essays on mobile phones because their parents can't afford a fixed connection, when the unemployed are forced to hunt for jobs without the aid of broadband because the price is just too high, we have an affordability problem. Discrimination also plays a key role. At every income level, people of color are less likely to adopt broadband than their white counterparts. Taken together, there is strong evidence that lack of affordability, lack of competition, and racial discrimination are keeping people offline. Better maps will help target public investments to improve broadband deployment, and that's good. But your unserved constituents can't use on-ramps to a digital superhighway they can't afford to ride. That is why, while we support the bills in today's hearing, we urge this subcommittee to see them as a stepping stone. Improving the national broadband map is valuable, so long as policymakers stay true to the principle of ensuring publicly available deployment data and remember that the digital divide is much broader than maps or deployment alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Spalter, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta and other distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on behalf of the members of U.S. Telecom, large and small, who collectively have invested far more and for far longer than any other sector to connect rural America. Today's hearing is appropriately focused on one of the most critical questions before our country. Will every person in this nation have access to the foundation of the 21st century American dream? Bridging the digital divide is not a partisan issue. This is an American opportunity. And we're at a pivotal moment where we have the tools ready and the bipartisan will to ensure that we can identify and connect the unconnected quickly, efficiently, and accurately. We convene today to focus on one of the biggest barriers to achieving our goal, the fact that our nation still lacks a single map that can accurately identify every home and business that is currently unserved. If we can't see it, we can't fix it. And that's why U.S. Telecom launched the Broadband Mapping Initiative and its proof of concept pilot program to show its costs and benefits. We all understand the severe limitations of the one-served, all-served census block approach that still guides federal investments in achieving universal broadband service. In the past, it did serve an important purpose, helping public-private efforts increase rural connectivity by more than 70% in the last decade. But we've reached a plateau. The good news is that with the advent of new data sources and processing capabilities and the bipartisan support here in Congress and at the FCC, we can now quickly and affordably account for every single served and unserved location in the nation and deliver near 2020 vision on the challenge before us. Our mapping initiative brought together a diverse group of partners who stepped up to the plate to forge a lasting solution. We launched the pilot program in April. Our goal was focused to identify the precise number and location of every broadband serviceable location in the pilot states and demonstrate the ability to scale the approach nationally using modern data sources. And with that foundation, demonstrate how providers can report broadband availability on top of that foundational data set, shapefile or otherwise. It's now complete, and the findings are crystal clear. Yes, we can quickly and affordably map the gap, and with a degree of accuracy that makes the census block or shapefile only approaches look like pin the tail on the donkey. Equally important, we can take this step concurrent with any new broadband support programs, such as the FCC's potentially game-changing $20 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, in a manner that need not delay, indeed would likely accelerate our ability to finally and truly connect every part of our nation. This is a once-in-a-generation leap forward in identifying the availability of broadband. We conducted the pilot in Virginia and Missouri. We're now happy to be working with the FCC and you to scale our approach nationwide, producing a visibility into our country that no regulator or provider has ever seen before. And our findings underscore the urgency of this work, identifying a margin of error of as high as 38% under today's approaches. That's up to 445,000 homes marked served that could in fact be unserved in our 2 pilot states alone. To argue that we need to choose between speed and allocating scarce federal dollars based only on existing reporting approaches and accuracy in the form of better maps later is a false choice. Our pilot proves we can do both, be quick and be accurate. That's one of the reasons why U.S. Telecom strongly supports the Bipartisan Broadband Data Act and the MAPS Act that mandates the proper ready, aim, fire sequencing of mapping the gap and then targeting finite federal resources with a precision that has not been possible to date. Critically, the legislation wisely pairs more granular reporting on the one hand with more precise location identification to close the digital divide once and for all. Today should be a galvanizing moment, a unifying and bipartisan sense of determination combined with innovative new data capabilities put victory at long last within reach. But as we approach the finish line, we cannot back down a single step on how we define the win. Creating a complete database of all broadband serviceable locations will provide policymakers a necessary picture of where scarce taxpayer dollars should be targeted and allow providers the best opportunity to invest those resources efficiently and with greatest impact, increasing speed and minimizing waste. Most importantly, this new mapping approach directed in the legislation before us today will render visible and thus reachable the unseen and the unserved. So thank you again for calling on us to raise our sights and raise the bar when it comes to connecting all Americans. I'm really happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stegman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. My name is James Stegman. I am president of CostQuest Associates, and it is an honor to be here again to discuss the status of broadband in this country. For the last 20 years, CostQuest has taken pride in empowering the public and private sector with the ability to make data-driven decisions with their most critical resources. And we seek to do the same for broadband mapping. While CostQuest is known for its cost expertise, the integration of geospatial design and data forms the underpinning of all our studies, analysis, and models. As for my own experience, I'm a statistician by trade, and as Hal Varian, chief economist at Google, said in 2009, the sexy job in 10 years will be statisticians. As you listen to my testimony today in 2019, I'll let you decide if Hal was right. Now, let me jump to the heart of my testimony. A coalition of leading broadband innovators launched the Broadband Mapping Initiative in April of 2019 to demonstrate the feasibility of identifying the precise number and locations of structures that require broadband access in Missouri and Virginia. The resulting data set, known as the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric, makes it possible to precisely map and understand where broadband is available, and more importantly, where it isn't. Let me first walk through what the fabric represents. The fabric is based upon parcel data, tax assessor data, building polygons, addresses, and roads. Combined through our unique geospatial process, we were able to identify the broadband serviceable location on the vast majority of parcels. Where the data were inconclusive, we sent records, 140,000 in total, out to our partner firm at Crowd Reason, who managed a visual review using a crowd labor pool. Now, let me share some of our key findings. First, the pilot was a success. Developing the fabric for 2 states showed it can be done for the entire country. Second, we can identify the unserved. For rural census blocks in Missouri and Virginia that are considered served by the current 477 guidelines, we found that 38% of those locations were not reported as served by the carriers in the study. This amounts to 445,000 homes and businesses. Third, we found that location counts differ. The fabric revealed that 48% of the location counts in rural census blocks are different from current estimates used by the FCC. This is meaningful when assessing the scope of the unserved problem, determining build-out requirements, and ultimately how much budget is needed to remedy. Fourth, we found that the current data sets conflict with the fabric. In our pilot, census blocks identified for an address were different 28% of the time when comparing the provider-submitted location versus the fabric location. Under today's 477, this could impact which census blocks are reported. And finally, reporting is enhanced. Regardless of how the new FCC coverage reporting format is set up, the quality and validity of the reporting will be improved using location-specific data. Now, let me show you some slides at what the fabric reveals. In image 1, shown on the screen, I highlight what our current 477-based understanding of broadband coverage would look like today in 10 populated census blocks in rural Missouri. Using the pilot's provider's data, all the census blocks shaded in blue would be reported as served. This is the extent of our knowledge today. Nothing more, nothing less. We do not know if all customers in the census blocks are served or if it's only one. In image 2, I demonstrate what polygons might look like under the FCC's proposed coverage efforts, where carriers will file polygons that represent where they provide service. In this image, my team created hypothetical polygons, the light blue bounded areas, based on carrier-provided latitude and longitude coordinates. This is one approach to polygon creation. There are others, some of which can be found in Appendix D of my testimony. In image 3, using the fabric, I'm now able to reveal within these 10 census blocks the extent of served locations, the green dots, and more importantly, the unserved locations, the red dots. Of all the benefits of the fabric to me, this most clearly demonstrates why the fabric is needed. Specifically, polygon reported, as I showed in the previous image, will only provide or improve our knowledge of what the served areas look like. The fabric is needed to then provide knowledge of the unserved locations. In regard to next steps, can this fabric be generated nationally? Unequivocally, yes. How much time will it take? We estimate that starting from where the pilot left off, it should take no more than 5 to 8 months to stand up an initial national fabric for testing and 12 to 15 months to fully complete. And what will it cost? I estimate the initial cost to be between $8.5 and $11 million for a restricted use data set. That concludes my testimony. Thank you for your time, and I would encourage you to see my written testimony for additional details. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Concluded our openings. We are now going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So, Ms. Floberg, tell me, why is it so important that broadband coverage data be accessible to the public and be challengeable by third parties such as your organization?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we've seen and we've heard today a lot about the importance of ensuring that there is a check on whatever mapping system we implement, some ability for the public, for researchers to be able to look at the underlying data and say this reflects reality or this does not reflect reality. This is something that Free Press has done even very recently. We found an error in the FCC's Form 477 data where small ISP called Barrier Free had mistakenly reported serving 20% of the US population with fiber to the home speeds in less than 6 months' time. In reality, they served a much, much smaller percentage of the population, and that error actually threw off the FCC's entire analysis of how much broadband had been deployed, how much fiber had been deployed in that past 6 months. So making sure that that data is available for organizations such as Free Press, but also for members of the public to say, the map says I'm served by this many providers, that I'm served by these speed tiers, and I'm not, is really, really important.
Thank you. Mr. Stegman, it's a very interesting testimony. We know the FCC currently has about $20 billion for universal service programs. It's not been awarded, and then it's going to be used to fund a broadband build-out over the next 10 years. So let me, I don't know if it's possible, but you were able to do pilots on 2 states, Virginia and Missouri, and it may be a reach, but if you extrapolated your findings in those 2 states to the rest of the country, who across the country would be left behind if the FCC didn't look before it leaped over the next 10 years of broadband deployment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. In our study in Missouri and Virginia, we were able to unveil or reveal that there are unserved locations in what people considered served census blocks before. We are also able to identify that if carriers use address tools to identify which census blocks they report as served, those census blocks may be incorrect that they identify. So what we found in the study is that there's an underreporting of the unserved issue in the country. And there's many studies out there. I think Dr. George Ford put out a study that I think he estimated the unserved at potentially 4 million. We've seen estimates as high as in the 10 millions. It's hard for me to project forward for the nation, but I know it's in the millions. I just don't know the exact count at this time.
Thank you very much. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about how overstated and unreliable coverage maps hurt rural areas, but I don't have to drive very far outside of Pittsburgh before I experience dead zones, and despite the map saying that I'm covered. Mr. Spellmeyer, how does this issue affect consumers in urban and suburban areas as well as rural areas?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's certainly an issue, I think, for all Americans. You know, you can get in your car right here and drive 5 miles to the Potomac River, and there's some areas along there that you don't want to end up in trouble because there's no cell phone coverage. And you can't stop to figure out, oh, geez, which carrier's phone do I need to take along on my trip to Rock Creek Park? So we've got to fix it. I traveled down Highway 1 in California this year, I was shocked to see the expansive stretches where there's no coverage. The same thing's true. I've been to Weston, Oregon, that Chairman Walden mentioned earlier. We've got to fix it, both for the people in the rural areas and the people that get in their car and drive 10 miles.
Yeah, thank you very much. Boy, I'll tell you, we've been talking about this issue for as long as I can remember. Ms. Eshu told me we've been talking about this since they made the very first maps when the earth was flat. And it seems to me that we've got to get moving on this. I want to thank you all for your questions, your testimony. So the chair's now going to recognize Mr. Latta, the subcommittee ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to our witnesses. And that's a long time for those maps. But that's why we're here today, and really thank you all for your testimony. Mr. Balder, if I could start with you. U.S. Telecom's fabric building pilot appears to have been a productive start to identify which locations in rural areas need broadband and show gaps in the current data collection process. Building on that experience, I want to focus on where the rubber meets the road. Would you walk us through the expected timeline under your proposal from updating the collection of data for the broadband map to actually using the data to more accurately guide the universal service funding?
Thanks for that great question. As Mr. Stegman pointed out, it is possible to have a fully nationally realized, scalable, universal, harmonized, deduplicated map in 12 to 15 months. His estimates, and I think they're accurate in his project management capacity, that we can actually even deploy maps sooner than that will be scalable and usable. The important point, Congressman, is that once we actually can put pen down on this map and we can do it quickly, that can become the basis for guiding any new dollars going out the door for any broadband support program, including the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, to ensure that every taxpayer dollar is being used to its best and highest purpose as accurately as possible to reach the truly unserved in this country. This is attainable, and we can do it.
Thank you. If I could follow up, Mr. Astley, if I could ask you, when it comes to the actual data used to create the map, how helpful are the quality of service metrics in shaping our picture of broadband availability, driving the funding decisions these maps are designed to determine?
Congressman, thank you for the question. The broadband map is a map that reflects coverage, so it is really aimed at focusing where networks are and where they are not. The quality of service really, I think, only relates to the speed tiers in the data requests that the FCC makes. So it's really kind of a separate issue, and one of the reasons we're so focused on the shapefile portion of improving the map is because we believe that will offer the quickest improvement on a national scale in the quickest amount of time.
Thank you. Mr. Spellmeyer, how can Congress ensure that there is a meaningful challenge process to validate data while also protecting the proprietary data that providers and third-party vendors and consumers may supply through a commission-developed process to inform on the map?
Congressman, your legislation and much of the legislation in front of us today outlines some stronger parameters for how the FCC would run a challenge process, at least on the wireless side. We think that's needed. In terms of confidentiality of data, there are certain inputs to a wireless map that may be confidential. But beyond that, I believe it's actually important that the public see the map and understand what the maps look like. One of the biggest mistakes the FCC made last time was not to allow the American public to participate in the challenge process. This legislation gets that right, but it's really hard for a consumer to go out and participate in the challenge process if they don't understand who's claiming coverage where. So I think it's essential that we make sure that that information gets out to the public while protecting. There's certain proprietary inputs like the height on a tower where someone's got a particular antenna that you might want to keep confidential, but beyond that, the rest of it should come forward.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Acey, how do shapefiles from different providers factor into this endeavor, and what's the benefit?
Well, the benefit is, we're currently living with a system that is not based upon how providers actually build their networks. We are essentially retrofitting data into a census block map. Shapefiles will allow providers to actually draw the shape and the contours of where they offer service. And whether or not you are a cable provider or a fixed wireless provider or a telco, you will be able to provide that data and essentially layer it on top of the national map so that we can actually identify in a more granular way those places that are being served with broadband today, and we can, more importantly, identify those places that are yet to get service.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks very much for today's hearing. Thanks to our witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I'll recognize Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the witnesses. Very informative, kind of exciting testimony this morning. So I'm looking forward to seeing progress on this issue. In my district, I know there's wide areas that are, we just don't have enough data to know if people are being served or not. In fact, I know people that aren't served. So this is an important issue. Ms. Bloomfield, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of the challenge process and crowdsourcing. I'm kind of following up on Mr. Latta. Could you tell us more about how these methods will help obtain reliable results? Just explain the process a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate the question. So, with the better mapping, if you start with the shapefiles that the FCC's talked about, you'll start to get more granular data. So we'll be able to start to see a better picture. But remembering it's still self-reported. So how do you make sure that you are validating what people are reporting? So if a carrier is reporting something, what we want to know is, on the ground, that's what's really happening. So that is the advantage of things like crowdsourcing, where you can basically allow consumers on the ground to get some feedback and say, yeah, we're seeing this or we're not seeing this. The one thing I would caution again is, if you ask me today what speed I'm getting at my house, I'm not sure I could give you the answer. Yeah. So I think it's the ability to, whoever is handling that information, see what trends, where are you seeing spaces really bright up, that there clearly are problems, there clearly are issues. So again, it's that ability to take that accuracy and make sure that we can also be granular at the same time.
Thank you. Ms. Floberg, in your testimony, you raised the issue of compatibility with historical 477 data. Can you elaborate on that and its importance? Do you have any recommendations that would follow?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. We do believe that it is really important to make sure that even as we make the maps more granular and more accurate, that we preserve the ability to compare new deployment data to the old deployment data so that we can see trends where they're happening. This also gives us the opportunity to compare deployment data with granular data from the Census Bureau about demographics to figure out who is being served and who isn't being served. So maintaining some ability to not just have this granular data about who's unserved, but to still be able to aggregate that to the census block level will preserve an abundance of rich analysis that we can move forward with. I think the Broadband Data Act does have some great language about that, about ensuring backwards compatibility. So really, it just comes down to making sure that that data is available to the public and available in a way that's easy to make those comparisons and do that analysis.
Is there also a thing about how trends are, what the trends are, or is that like too far in the future for now? What the trends in terms of coverage is?
I think that definitely maintaining that compatibility is how we would be able to see trends. It would also be a way for us to see how these new, more granular sets of data have potentially improved, how we keep track of who is unserved and who isn't. It would give us, I think, the ability to see much better trends in deployment as we move forward with better maps.
Thank you. Mr. Segman, we've heard about the importance of making broadband mapping data publicly available. I want to make sure that the data being collected will also be accessible and usable by households, small businesses, and local governments across my district in particular. Do you foresee any challenges in making that possible?
There are challenges in creating the fabric data set. If we go a proprietary route, we can get to the answer a bit quicker with less money. because the data quality is better. The proprietary route doesn't mean it's not viewable by the public. What the proprietary data means is it's restricted in use, that someone can't download the entire country of all the data. They can't download full states, but it is usable by companies, by the public to do that. The alternative route is to use kind of an open data set, open source data sets that are out there that we can initiate the process. We actually did that in Missouri to see how it would work. It will work, but it will require additional visual verification because the records will not match in sync as well as the proprietary data. That public open data set can be released and used by the public, the same as the proprietary, but it would have less restrictions on use.
Well, I'm going to have to close here, or I'm going to get gabbled out. But Mr. Stugman and Mr. Spalter, you made it sound like creating these maps is accurate, granular, and with low latency is something that we can actually achieve in a fairly short time. So I hope you're right.
I'm confident that we are.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes my friend, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcomed our 6 witnesses. I'd like to start out with a point of personal privilege. Remind everybody here that September 11th is not just a day to remember what happened 18 years ago in New York, in D.C., and Pennsylvania. 7 years ago in Benghazi, 4 Americans were killed, Ambassador Smith and 3 others, when they were overrun by terrorists. So please, later today, pray for their lives as well as lives were lost here in New York and Pennsylvania on 9/11. Now, I got to open by saying Texas 22 is a big suburb. We have a lot of broadband access. That's not a problem. But my state is huge, and Texas has some real issues that you guys have brought up. For example, Mr. Hurd is not here, Will Hurd, but he has one county called Loving County, has one small town, population of 134 people. I guarantee you if one person on that map has access or reports access, the whole city has access, and that is just not true. So my questions come from my role as a co-chair of the House Artificial Intelligence Caucus, the AI Caucus. I'm a co-chair with Dr. McNerney over there. And Form 477, the primary source the FCC uses to assess access for broadband, et cetera, has some real problems that you all brought up today. I mean, there's false positives, coverage when there's not coverage, the maps, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to ask y'all to put on your thinking caps and put on that AI cap. How can AI help resolve these problems you have going forward? Ms. Bloomfield, you're up first, ma'am. Any ideas?
Knew that was going to be the downside of sitting here, right? So I think, you know, when you think about AI and you think about applications, for example, I have a company down on the border of Mexico that is in Texas that actually uses a lot of AI and drone technology to do border security. So thinking about, you know, first of all, you've got to have the access, and then you've got to think about what are the applications that you can enable, particularly in an area where you've got a wide swath of land. So I think I think we're just starting to explore. Thankfully, this isn't a privacy hearing, but I think there's a lot of different applications. But first, you've got to have the connectivity to enable the cool things that you want to be able to do.
Thank you. Mr. Asay.
Yes, Congressman, I think technology, whether it's AI or other technology, certainly plays a large role in helping us fill the gaps and provide service to unserved America, whether that is through the technology that cable companies offer or the technology that other broadband providers offer. But first thing we have to do is really get that accurate picture of what we're up against and what the challenges of geography and low density are providing.
I think AI can help with that. Mr. Spellmeyer, for the mobile phones, how about AI?
Well, Congressman, I'm no artificial intelligence expert, but I don't know that we need to get to artificial intelligence, but as I sit here reflecting on the wireless side, I think there's already several players out there in the ecosystem that have an awful lot of data actually about coverage, and those companies that come to mind are Apple and Google. They track a significant amount that goes on up and down on every handset every day. They know that I'm sitting here on the 3rd floor. of the Rayburn building right now. And we should try to find ways to leverage that down the road to improve coverage data.
Thank you. Ms. Floberg.
I don't think we can suggest any particular AI applications, but I do think that making sure that the underlying deployment data is publicly available will make sure that others can think of what those innovative ideas might be.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Spalter.
One of the critical issues about the deployment of AI in the future is that it will be enabled and enhanced and turbocharged when we actually can deploy nationally 5G technologies. And for too long, 5G technologies have been considered to be the province of only of our urban and suburban residents and enterprises. If we can map broadband accurately, granularly, with the process and the methodology we're suggesting, pinpointing where there is, in fact, unserved locations, and couple that with other reporting technologies and provide that to programs like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that will mean we'll be able to pull fiber to places like your communities and Mr. Hurd's district and your district that then can use fiber-enabled resources to empower rural communities from benefiting from 5G, and with 5G, use the cloud scale algorithms, machine learning, and other data processes that are enabled and will enable artificial intelligence applications for healthcare, for education, for advanced manufacturing, for all kinds of things. But we have to start with accurate mapping, and that's why we've stood up our pilot program and want it to be integrated into the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund.
Thank you. Mr. Stegman.
Yes, I'm excited to say that we actually use machine learning and artificial intelligence on the fabric. If you think about it, we'll have over a terabyte worth of data, 170 million building locations, 150 million parcels, and trying to weed through that information intelligently, it will be a struggle. And we've incorporated machine learning and other efforts to actually be able to do that successfully.
And that's why I saved you for last. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. Since Superstorm Sandy ravaged my district, I've been very focused on network resiliency, and I know there are so many uses for granular broadband data, but building a national location fabric could be quite helpful in disaster response. Mr. Floberg, what do you think about that, if I could ask you? Ms. Floberg, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. I think that there's definitely potential here. The kind of fabric that we've heard CostQuest and others describe could potentially be very useful for making sure that we have the best and most accurate data about when there are these outages in response to natural disasters, where people are experiencing those outages, where folks are who might need help, who might need resources directed by our disaster response. How we do that and how we ensure that we get the appropriate data from carriers about where those outages are and where there are problems with network resiliency that need to be resolved, I think is an open question, but we can certainly see the potential in having that kind of granular data about where folks are who are going to need assistance.
Thank you. And Mr. Spellmeyer, do you think better wireless maps will be useful for public safety in the wake of disasters?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Without that information, you're flying blind. The wireless industry works pretty hard in advance of and during disasters to try to stay on top of outages and to communicate with public safety. And we've made that as an industry an even greater priority since Hurricane Sandy, thanks to your leadership. We know instantly because of remote monitoring when a cell tower goes down. And if we're in a hurricane situation, we have an obligation to report that to the FCC that same day, and we do that. And we try to regularly communicate with public safety to leverage that information. But certainly continuing to improve these maps and to make sure that everybody understands who claims to have coverage where will help.
Well, thanks. I think the committee should be very proud of the bills before us today. And in particular, I believe that including metrics for quality of service is a valuable addition. And once this legislation passes, I hope we can build on the progress we've made to give consumers more insight into the quality of the service that broadband providers offer. But if I could just ask the entire panel just a yes or no, would each of you commit to working with the committee to build on the concept of quality of service with the aim of helping to better inform consumers? And again, a simple yes or no, if I could start with Ms. Bloomfield.
Absolutely.
Mr. Assey.
Yes.
Absolutely.
100.
Would love to.
All right, thank you. Now let me go back to Ms. Floberg. Significantly in your written testimony, you note that the data that goes into the FCC's broadband maps needs to be publicly available, and I agree. In my opinion, this data must be available for researchers who can double-check the FCC's analysis, local governments who can check the accuracy of the data, and for consumers who can use it to understand better what is available. So, Ms. Floberg, from your perspective, considering all Free Press's analysis of broadband deployment data, what would happen if the FCC kept this information to itself?
Well, I think first and foremost, it would absolutely throw a wrench in the works for having any sort of functional challenge process to get a sense of whether or not the maps and the data that's being reported from carriers is accurate. But I think it would also have tremendous other impacts. Free Press has used the deployment data to assess where there is racial disparities in broadband deployment. That would be much more difficult without that kind of deployment information. We've also used it to assess the accuracy of claims about investments stalling out in the wake of the 2015 Open Internet Order. So there's all sorts of different kinds of analysis related to broadband deployment that would become much, much more difficult for researchers as well as for members of the public simply to gauge whether or not the maps are correct, that they have service or that they don't have service.
Thank you. And then my last question is Mr. Spalter. I also know quickly fixing the FCC's maps is important. Do you think H.R. 4229 strikes the right balance in that regard?
We do, and we commend this body and this legislation in particular for advancing three principles. One is that we actually need to prioritize mapping as part of any effort to move forward in accurately determining where unserved Americans, residences and enterprises are. Second, that there's a need for speed in doing so. And third, that it provides bidders, providers, ultimately, who will be seeking these resources to deliver these services, the ability to do so with pinpoint accuracy, limiting the risk that we're wasting taxpayer dollars and speeding up our efforts to actually deploy broadband to unserved Americans so that we can close the digital divide once and for all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to you all for being here. Accurate broadband mapping is incredibly important so that industry and government can work to provide internet service to and underserved areas. It's been one of the bigger goals of this committee, and it's the only goal of the Rural Broadband Caucus, on which I'm proud to serve as a co-chair. Billions of dollars have been invested by the government and industry alike, and substantial improvements have been made, but there's too many Americans without adequate broadband service. And the fact that there are Americans here in 2019 with no service at all is just beyond me. There is near universal agreement that the current mapping methodology is outdated, to put it nicely. We've heard arguments today about not only the maps and the data, but the need for government to quickly disperse funds to continue the build-out. I just want to state that the speed at which funding goes out should be a goal, but it can't be the only goal. For what seems like forever now, government, industry, and Main Street have been complaining about the inaccuracy of broadband maps. Should we move quickly here? Yes, absolutely. But given the complexities of the issue and the difficulty striking the right balance, we may not have a similar opportunity to do this again for some time. So I'd like to move quickly, but it's vital that we get it right so we aren't spending billions of dollars with no effective metrics or meaningful oversight. The most important goal must be to get service to those Americans that have never had it at their homes, their business, or their schools. There's a balance to be struck here, and I'm optimistic that we can find it. So first question for Mr. Spalter. It's encouraging that U.S. Telecom received input from several wireline providers during its pilot program. It's clear, however, that more partnerships are needed from all fixed and wireless providers. How does U.S. Telecom propose that industry could partner and coordinate in developing this data, and would regularly held private industry working groups in coordination with policymakers factor into building that database?
We were very privileged and lucky that a number of innovative wireline providers stood up and stood tall to work with us in advancing this idea that we can deliver more accurate data, not only of served broadband locations, but unserved locations, so that we could present to you and to the FCC and to any government agency the clarity that's required to guide our future broadband support programs. I'm disappointed that not all wireline providers decided to join with us in our effort, particularly the cable industry. However, we know that there are some very utilizable data sets that we have available that are immediately available once we complete the map to deploy not only finally a national broadband map, but broadband support programs like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that will be effective. In terms of continued partnership, we want to work not only with all parts of government in a harmonized way, but we commend the legislation that's before this body to ensure that there's actually coordination amongst and between government agencies in utilizing maps, and we as an industry are very eager and ready to work with all parts of government, from the FCC to the Commerce Department, the Agricultural Department, and beyond, to advance these maps, including at the state and local level as well. This is all achievable, and we need to understand that if we are going to design and deploy effective broadband support programs, they need to have an undergirding foundational data set upon which all kinds of different reporting mechanisms, including shapefiles, can be added in order for us to get the job done of closing the digital divide.
Thank you. Mr. Assey, how do cable providers propose to combine efforts with the wireline and wireless industries to build on the recent pilot program?
Well, I think first and foremost, as I mentioned in my testimony, we are focused on delivering the shapefiles that are going to accurately show the places that are already served. The important thing when we're talking about serving unserved America relative to the fabric and the buildings that may exist in unserved America, that to me goes to the how much it's going to cost to the would-be bidders to extend service there. So we believe that actually making progress and getting the shapefiles done out there and located on the map will give us a better sense of the areas we need to focus on and allow us to come up with new strategies to actually devote the scarce resources that we do have where they're most needed.
So from your perspective, does the fabric tell us which locations have access to broadband?
The fabric doesn't, the shapefiles will tell us, and the process that we're going to create to have providers actually demonstrate this is where we believe we can serve, and we have a verification process and a public crowdsourcing process to make sure that we get that right. And then we can focus our energies on making sure we spend the dollars to hook up more people to broadband in unserved America.
Well, I have more questions, but time flies when you're having fun, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Lobsack for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to say again, thank you to Mr. Latta for helping on the bill that we're offering today. We've worked together really well. And I want to thank the members who've been here longer than I have been. Some of those folks' names were mentioned already. Too many for me to repeat, but I've only been on this committee now for 5 years. I'm in my 5th year. I'm still kind of a newbie, and I won't be here after this term any longer in the Congress. So there's a little urgency on my part to get this done before I get out of here so that the people of my district, people of Iowa, the people of the country can benefit from better maps. I've often said garbage in is garbage out, and that's the way it has been in the past, unfortunately, the way these maps have been constructed, and then the potential uses of those maps, too. A couple of other quick points. Ms. Floberg, I want to thank you for talking about the affordability issue. That's really, really critical, and I really appreciate that. And you know, affordability is, we talk about a rural-urban divide, and most of us are talking about rural access today. But affordability is not just a rural or urban issue. It is a national issue. And so thank you. And Mr. Spalter, I hope you don't ever come to my state to run against any of my friends, because you're awfully damn inspirational. And thank you very much for your remarks today. Not to take away from anybody else, but this has really been a great panel, I have to say. I do want to just ask, first of all, Mr. Assey, a quick question about crowdsourcing, but before I do that, I have to repeat the experience that we've had in my district with Sheraton Valley Electric Cooperative. They've missed out on getting funding for building out, they're an electric cooperative, but they wanted to build out broadband. And the data indicated that there wasn't really any need for it, and it was based on census data and what have you. Absolutely horrendous decision on the part of the FCC to deny them funding. If you would, Mr. Hess, I know that you have an interest in crowdsourced data. Could you speak to that issue?
I think crowdsourcing is a very interesting and innovative idea for us to improve the accuracy of the data that we're going to get. Under the current mechanism for reporting, it's basically a very binary choice. You're either providing service somewhere in the census block or you're not. But we're now going to move to a regime in which providers themselves are going to have to draw shapes that are going to outline where they can provide service. And every point along that line, along the edge of that shape, is potentially a contestable question. So we are going to do our dead level best and work in good faith to provide data that is accurate and complete. But obviously people who live there, who have boots on the ground, they often know some things that we don't know here. So we really are going to have to work collaboratively to get this right.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Ms. Floberg, can you explain why knowing quality of service of available broadband is important for consumers? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the quality of service metrics are necessary simply for making the maps and determining whether or not service in a particular area counts as broadband according to the FCC's speed threshold, which currently defines that as 25 megabits per second downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream. We are encouraged to see that that is preserved in the Broadband Data Act, as well as the inclusion of latency, which is useful, especially for particular applications that consumers may want to use. And we think that there's a lot of benefit to additional quality of service metrics, usage limits, additionally possible pricing data, and we definitely appreciate that the language of this bill does not in any way prohibit the FCC from expanding on the definition and collecting data that it decides that it needs in the future.
Thank you so much. Ms. Bloomfield, I have a related follow-up question for you. When mapping broadband, why is it important to consider latency and not only speed?
Absolutely. So you think about the consumer experience when we go online and the things we anticipate doing and the uses that we have. So when you think about latency, again, you know, you're in a rural community, you're using telehealth. You certainly don't want latency if somebody is actually doing any kind of procedure on you. So you think about or distance learning, you know, children actually using the technology in the classroom and what that jitter and that buffering does to that experience for those kids in the classroom. So again, they're all part of the consumer experience, and they're not that difficult to actually gather that data as well, so it should absolutely be included.
Thank you so much, and I do have a follow-up question I'll submit for the record, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Spellmeyer.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Assey, the bills before us today all focus on solving the mapping challenge at the FCC. But for the last several appropriation cycles, Congress has given NTIA money to fund a modernization of the national broadband map. So do you see an ongoing role for NTIA in the mapping context?
Thank you for the question. I think all government agencies have a piece of this pie, whether it's NTIA, the FCC, or even the Department of Agriculture. And one of the things that is considered in this legislation that I think is extremely helpful is Congress's imprimatur and direction to the federal agencies to really coordinate and work together. And the creation of a better map through the use of shapefiles will give us the background that we need to ensure that all of the agencies, no matter which corner of the federal government they're operating in, are operating off the same playbook.
Well, I'm sure many of my colleagues are experiencing the same thing, especially those that live in rural areas when we go back home. You know, when I was first elected in 2010, one of the first things we started talking about in early 2011 was the need for an accurate broadband map. Here we are in 2019, we're still talking about the need for an accurate broadband map. The American people are getting frustrated with the lack of progress on this. We've spent a lot of money to try and solve this problem. I agree with you that it's going to take all of us working together, but at the end of the day, I'm a mule farming plowboy, you know, and I think we need to go back to the basics and be simple. It ain't that tough to figure out who's got broadband and who doesn't have broadband. I can't believe it's this dadburn complicated, but we need to figure it out. Ms. Floberg, just as coverage data may overstate the availability of service in some areas, consumers can experience a difference between the speed of the service they are advertised and the speed of the service they actually receive. Would it be helpful for consumers if the FCC collected data on actual speeds instead of or in addition to advertised speeds?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think that absolutely actual speeds are very valuable information for consumers to know, for policymakers to know, and could certainly be a part of this data collection. There currently is a project measuring Broadband for America that does collect some of this data, and this is part of why one of our main concerns is making sure that the data collected through Form 477 is publicly available and is compatible with other data sets. As long as we can take the data that we get from Form 477 about deployment and compare it and use it in conjunction with the data that the FCC does already collect about actual speeds, that also we think would serve to bring that important data point to the conversation.
Okay. Mr. Spellmeyer, do you have any thoughts on how we can identify and correct this problem so that rural users on the wrong side of the digital divide can have the same experience as urban users do?
And is your question in relation to the mapping or actually getting the service out to them?
It's the advertised versus the
actual.
what you actually get.
All right. Well, I wasn't going to wade into this, but you know, on the wireless maps, advertising plays no role. The one-time data collection that the FCC did was not based on advertised speeds. It was supposed to be an exercise to map areas where actual speed was above 5 megabits per second. That's what would happen under the legislation that's before the committee today on the wireless side. That's what's in the bill that's already passed the Senate Commerce Committee, and we hope to get signed into law.
Okay. All right. Ms. Bloomfield, when a network is built with support from either the Universal Service Fund or the Rural Utility Service, what sort of validation processes should be used to ensure that the network is actually delivering consistent, high-speed service as intended?
It's a really excellent point, because when you're a steward of federal support, whether it's USF or the Reconnect, you really want to make sure that the consumer is getting what you say they're going to get from that support. One of the things that the FCC did that I think is really interesting, when they designed universal service support, they basically required providers to actually provide some of the information like latency and speed and things like that. So there are some requirements. It's part of the truce that you have when you work with the government. And I think Reconnect, one of the things that I think has been very interesting watching RUS is they're actually doing trials out in the field as they're looking at this new grant and grant loan program to actually see what's there, what's not there, what are the speeds that are there. So it is that extra step of doing that, you know, whether it's a challenge process or whether it's verification.
Thanks for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. When you look at the different sizes of the census blocks and the current rules as far as what counts and what doesn't, the gamesmanship that's happening right now becomes really obvious. The largest census tract is 8,500 square miles in Alaska, and they're as small as half a block. That could be, or 1/10 a square mile in an urban area. So when the rule is, quote, if the providers determine they could offer service to at least one household, you could see how terrible a map we could get. Providing one household to the Alaska tract that's 8,500 square miles, you would get the whole thing on the map. We can do obviously a lot better than that. In my district in South Osceola County and Polk counties, We have large census tracts, very rural areas. So my first question, Ms. Bloomfield, does this series of bills take care of all the loopholes that are preventing us from having an accurate broadband map in rural areas, or is there other things we're not addressing here?
What your legislation does is a really important start. It really starts to get more granular, and that's what we absolutely need to have. You know, my carriers provide service to folks on average 7 people per mile of wire. Here in DC, we've got 10,000. So you're right, you've got those huge swaths. But one of the things that we need to be thinking about, one of the things that's interesting and hasn't really come up is RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that the FCC is going to be rolling out, is really going to start with the unserved areas. So the beauty is we have the opportunity to move to the shapefile, start getting more granular, get better maps, and then as time goes on, move to some of the things like the work that U.S. Telecom has done, I really commend. But I think we don't want to hold back. I think it's that balance between you've got unserved people there. You know it every time you go back to a town hall meeting. I'm sure it's the first thing you hear. So how do we keep the process moving? And I think your legislation actually very nicely tees up that sequence.
So there's a synergy between this new funding and getting a more accurate map. Mr. Stegman, are we covering all the loopholes that we need to for right now, to get a more accurate rural map?
I think it hits most of the key topics, which are how shapefiles should be formed, or that shapefiles should be provided, that the fabric is needed. I think the fabric is a key part of this. There could be efforts to help explain what a shapefile represents. I'm sure if I asked anybody here, you're not quite sure what a shapefile is. And I'm sure many providers don't know what a shapefile is, and they're going to have to come up with it. So there may be some clarification on what those things represent and what can be in and what can be out.
That's helpful. I'm also concerned about how our broadband efforts are working nationally vis-a-vis some of our competitors on the world stage, whether it's what they're doing in China, Japan, or Europe. Mr. Spalter, how are our broadband efforts stacking up to places like China and Europe?
I think that the record is very clear in a hotly competitive national market. The size and the scale that the United States is, our broadband service is unparalleled. We are investing as an industry close to $80 billion of CapEx in our national broadband infrastructure. On a per capita basis, that is an extraordinary step. One of the wonderful challenges that this body, Congress, the FCC, and others have posed is, can we extend broadband service not just to our urban and suburban and even ex-urban areas, but also to our rural areas that are some of the hardest to reach places on the planet. And which is why we believe that if we can actually accelerate our efforts to have a granular and accurate national broadband map guiding some of our future investment, coupled with shapefiles and other types of reporting methodologies, we will actually not only get the unserved served, but improve national broadband performance overall.
And Ms. Floberg, how are we stacking up to China and Europe and others right now as far as our efforts to provide a better broadband coverage throughout the United States?
I can't speak as much to the international comparisons, but I think we can hear already from folks in this country where we're falling short. I think that a huge part of this conversation that needs to be talked about more really is the affordability portion. We have, even in the areas where we've made efforts and successful efforts to deploy broadband at the fastest available speeds, we're often leaving behind people who can't afford a $70 a month bill to get onto Charter's entry-level tier of 200 megabits per second. So I think we can see some of those issues and those problems even when we just focus on looking inside the United States.
Thanks, Neil. Back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Assey, as I said in my opening remarks this morning, I believe it is important for any broadband mapping to be paired with appropriate enforcement measures that ensure providers' submissions are complete and accurate. While enforcement is important to be mindful that unintentional mistakes can happen from time to time. My question is this: do you think it makes sense to clarify that the standards set forth in the MAPS Act, including the word recklessly, is not intended to apply to providers who submit information or data under this Act that contains minor mistakes, small omissions or overstatements or other unintentional errors?
Yes, I do. I think, as you point out, it is one thing to intentionally ignore or violate a rule, but we are really embarking upon a new regime here with the drawing of shapefiles, and we have some familiarity with them because they're used, whether it's at the RUS, there have been pilots in Kansas, but this is going to involve a lot of different data points, and innocent mistakes can be made. I think the issue is going to be, are they material and intentional that would be of concern?
Yeah, well, that's a different bailiwick if they're intentional, but I'm talking about just the minor mistakes, as we said. Mr. Stegman, I was very excited to see that my home state of Missouri was included in one of the 2 states used in the Broadband Mapping Initiative program. How much will it cost to produce a nationwide map based on the pilot program that you just completed? And are there some existing data points that could be used that would reduce those costs?
Thank you for that question, and we were happy. I always forget. Thank you for that question, and we were happy to do Missouri. It was a good state to look at. It presented a lot of unique characteristics that we could test out. As we looked at that map, we expect a national fabric to cost around $10 million if we're able to use some proprietary data. We think we can turn that up within a year so that it's usable, that it can help inform polygons.
Cost how much again? What did you say?
10 million.
Okay.
10 million just for the fabric. We think that fabric will then be useful for the creation of the polygons or the shapefiles to help inform them. It'll be useful for the consumer to actually be able to look at their point on the Earth's surface and understand what those shapefiles mean. What would help improve the program is for states to step forward with databases. In Missouri, Missouri does not have a statewide 911 database. That would have been informative to the effort had that occurred, and that we could pull that in, but counties do have that. So going nationally, I think we would expect or ask that states contribute information to us of known locations. Many states have good address data sets, good locational data sets that would just help improve the process and potentially bring down the cost. A big portion of the cost is actually the visual verification that Crowd Reason did for us. Each record is actually reviewed by a person who's looking at satellite imagery, clicking on the map of where the location is. If we can reduce that, it will reduce total costs.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question for you. One of your primary conclusions was that up to 38% of unserved households in the 2 states, that being Missouri and Virginia, you collected data for would have been missed or deemed served by previous FCC Form 477 efforts. Could you break down that percentage a bit by explaining, if possible, how that figure could be different based upon additional data from cable and wireless broadband providers?
Yeah, we did. So when we put together the study for Missouri and Virginia, we only had a limited number of providers in the study. We did not have cable providers participating in providing us data of what they served. So when we published the 38%, we did note that that is at the high end of our estimate of what the total unserved is, and that it could potentially come down as we get more providers reporting information. We attempted to estimate that by removing blocks that the cable providers serve in the current 477 effort, and when we did it, it cut it in about half. So it's still a significant issue, even if we brought in all the cable companies and assume the cable companies served every household in the blocks that they serve today.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. With scarce federal resources being spent every year for broadband development, we can all agree that the need to produce accurate broadband coverage maps has never been greater. I believe mapping legislation passed out of this committee should be quickly scalable, produce detailed coverage data swiftly, and not place extra reporting burdens on small internet providers. We know too well that the census block reporting structure is outdated and hurting rural and tribal communities. Simply ask small-town businesses across America, economic development groups, our teachers educating children, our public safety officials and first responders, our citizens nationwide in rural areas whose quality of life is being impacted daily without affordable connectivity. They'll all say that our coverage maps are failing them, and we must act swiftly to fix them, if they knew what a coverage map was. This is going to require partnerships for coordination and investment. America needs these families where they're at. They need to have a good quality of life. Urban America really needs these families where they're at, whether it's for food or water or transportation or energy, you name it. Urban society, urban America doesn't exist without them where they're at. And so we need to find an answer to this. Mr. Essie, yeah, you stated that the goal of broadband mapping should be to focus on on where broadband is and isn't, and that trying to layer other types of data into this particular effort, while laudable, could cause unintended delays. What exactly is the type of data that the FCC should focus on collecting for broadband mapping, and how quickly could this type of data be replicated nationwide?
Thank you for the question. I think first and foremost, we should follow the direction that the FCC set down in the order it recently adopted in August and push forward with the adoption of shapefiles. I think that gives us a granular picture of where broadband is and where broadband isn't. I think the idea of the location tool and really getting atomistically into the longitude and latitude of individual buildings in unserved America could certainly be of interest, and there is a proceeding teed up at the FCC to answer a number of the questions that the pilot project turned up. So I think it's certainly of something that we should continue to look at and pursue, but I would not want that to slow the progress that we are about to make in moving to a shapefile-based reporting.
And what about timing? How quickly could that data be replicated nationwide?
Well, that really is up to, I think right now we're waiting on some direction from USAC. The order has been adopted by the commission, but we have folks who are, making the plans now to be able to comply as quickly as possible.
Oh, God help us. Ms. Bloomfield, NTCA's membership knows all too well the struggles that small internet service providers often face in providing broadband in difficult-to-reach rural communities. I was just out in my district, and I traveled about 4,500 miles, and I had cell reception at least half the time. So I can just imagine what the rest of it's like. As Congress and the FCC work towards reforming the reporting requirements that produce our maps, could you outline the importance of mapping legislation offering technical and financial assistance to small providers under a new reporting structure?
I appreciate your thinking that way because, again, as you look at carriers, particularly small ones, taking on additional burdens, the question is, if you've got a staff of 15, what can you actually accomplish? I think from a shapefile perspective, I think that folks already file so much data now because most of my companies are universal service recipients. So they're very used to collecting data, sharing data. That's part of kind of their process. Going to a more complex system, greatly appreciate the thought process that you may be leading down, which is that there may take more resources as we get even more granular to help some of these smaller providers actually track where exactly those locations that are served or are not exist.
I'm not leading down it. That's where I'm going.
Excellent.
And thank you for your comments. I just want to say we need to invest more as a government in this process. It's about our citizens and their safety also. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Flores for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Republican Leader Latter, for holding this important hearing, and I want to thank the panel for joining us today. Each time the subject of rural broadband and rural mobile service comes up, people invariably complain about the maps, and so it's important that we get this right. Also, no one on this committee wants to have a repeat of the VTOP program earlier in this decade where $4 billion was pushed out the door, and we got virtually no effect on expanding coverage. As a matter of fact, there's only 2 projects that have received funding since 2010, and the rest of it was essentially wasted. Mr. Assay, my question for you is this. In your testimony, you highlighted a need for any mapping track data to show areas where providers have been awarded federal funds to deploy broadband. In doing so, we could properly designate the national broadband map to reflect, first of all, which areas are using, or second, which areas will require federal assistance to provide service. I couldn't agree more that we need to make sure that finite resources go to the truly unserved, and that private stakeholders involved in building out the next generation of technology know that they're not going to be competing with the federal government when they make their investment. So my first question is this: to what extent would it be helpful for the national broadband map to require additional reporting information for the areas that are covered using federal funds?
I think it would be very helpful. You know, I totally agree with the points you made about duplication and really sending funds to places that broadband already exists. That, to me, is not the best stewardship of public funds. But I also think it's important not only to make sure that our money is spent wisely, but also to ensure that there's accountability when we do actually fund projects, to make sure that we know exactly where broadband was delivered and that the map is updated appropriately.
Okay. And continuing along the question of duplication, to your knowledge, how much interagency coordination occurs to avoid cross-subsidizing in the same area with different federal programs, such as the High Cross program and the Rural Utility Service program?
I don't know that I would hazard a guess on how much coordination there is. I know that they obviously do talk from time to time, but I think they're all dealing with imperfect tools presently, and our hope is by getting a better broadband map that will assist their coordination, and certainly your push in the right direction will help as well.
That's certainly something we in Congress need to work on, is making sure we're not having duplication of efforts and when it comes to subsidization programs. Mr. Spellmeyer, I agree with your testimony in which you voiced your support for H.R. 4229, the Broadband Data Act, and specifically for the inclusion and standardization of definitions for radio frequency engineering terms used to measure signal strength and propagation. Further, you note that this bill would require the FCC to continue revising the rules in the future to reflect changes in mapping-related technologies. Can you expand on why common standards are so important for mapping needs, and to what extent standardization will be helpful as the next generation of mapping technologies is developed?
Well, certainly getting a common set of standards is important when you're trying to take the claimed coverage by, you know, a number of providers, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a given area, and overlay them on top of each other. That's where the FCC kind of veered off course a number of years ago. Chairman Pai made some efforts to try to standardize it with the last one-time data collection. Unfortunately, we're going to be headed back, I think, after this legislation passes, to do another one-time data collection. It's really important that we fix some of the things like the cell edge probability, because if that number's too low, you're building in an error factor that, once you lay one map on top of the other, begins to multiply itself. Now, it's also important, to the second half of your question, to focus on evolving technologies over time. We're on the precipice of 5G. My company wants to bring 5G to lots of places in rural America. And the legislation gives the FCC the tools to update that over time as that continues to deploy.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Eshoo for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My number one wish is that under your leadership and that of Mr. Latta, that we get this done. It's been a long time. It's too long. To all of the witnesses, you've given terrific testimony, and we're always better for it. We really do pay attention to what you say. This is about mapping our future, the future of America. And sometimes I think we get bogged down in, well, in many ways by necessity in a lot of the details. But I think the overarching call to action needs to be based on what I just said, that this is a map for America's future. And my first question is, if each one of you can say yes or no, well, let's see what you'll say. Based on the legislation that's at hand, and I think will succeed, it's bipartisan, it's sensible, it has strength in it, all of those factors. If technologies change, and they always do, given all the collective expertise at the table, does this legislation, can it stretch itself so that it meets future challenges? In other words, if it's just for now and what we have now, then you know what? You're going to be back here testifying, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to show up for meetings on mapping. But do you think that this legislation speaks to the future technologies? I mean, you know, for example, moving to satellites. There are so many areas that I don't want to have to keep revisiting new types of fixed or mobile broadband technology, small cell sites, satellites. I could go on and on. You know what I'm talking about. So, yes, no?
So I would say the framework of the bill will live on. I think the standards could change, but that's up to the FCC to work on that. So absolutely, yes, this is a framework for the future.
Yes, I agree. And as you said, we're creating a map, but it's also a living map, so it needs to be flexible to accommodate new
Good.
technology.
Encouraging.
My answer would be absolutely, and the good news is the Senate is tired of dealing with this issue. They've moved a bill out of committee, and I think they're going to send it over here soon, and hopefully you guys can adopt it.
Wonderful.
We're also optimistic that this bill would be applicable and useful for future technology.
Great, good.
It is a strong, durable, and sustainable framework. It's based on, and this is the genius, that it insists that we at a granular level can map both served locations but also unserved locations, and then be able to update it as a living document with crowdsourcing and other types of more effective challenging mechanisms.
I would agree it does. It is a flexible bill, and it does provide flexibility into the future for new technologies as they come out.
Yeah. I think that Mr. Stegman is the only statistician on the panel today. Thank you very much. And I think the most often used word, because I've been here for a long time this morning, is granular. So whomever, I don't know, maybe there's a prize for that. Let me, I think each one of you have talked about the challenge process so that consumers and government officials can speak up when the FCC data doesn't reflect reality. My question is, this data is available today in CVS files, which is easily accessed in Microsoft Excel or Google Docs, and also easily accessed by researchers using R and Stata and other statistical software. Do you think that shapefiles can be turned into a format that's easily accessible for people to understand? This is a real operative phrase in my question. Easily accessible for people to understand so they know whether or not to challenge the FCC data.
If I can take a first shot at that.
Sure.
So shapefiles will be a challenge, only from the aspect of, one, normalization of what the shapefiles mean. Two is they're
I don't know what that
potentially,
means.
it's what are the shapefiles based on? Are they based on points? Are they based on roads? What does it represent?
I see.
And if my address falls in it, does that mean I'm served? Those types of issues. But there will be 4,000 of these potential shapefiles filed by all the providers. If you look at all of them out there, each one will have to provide shapefiles by speed. So it may overwhelm researchers. The point level data of the fabric actually may be easier to analyze just because it's point-specific data and I don't have to analyze all these shapefile layers that'll be stacked upon each other, which makes it difficult for research. It can be done, but point-level data just makes it a bit easier to work with the data.
Easier.
Easier.
I think my time has expired. I don't know if I get all of that or if my next door neighbor will know how to access this, but I'm going to trust what you said.
Gentlelady
Mr.
yields
Chairman.
back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for all of your testimony. I love what my colleague from California just said. Not only has she and others been working on this for a long time, but she's thinking about the future, as she always does, and is thinking about let's not pass something that is going to be stuck in time, and that's always the challenge with all of our legislation around technology. So thank you on the flexibility and the forward-leaning. I have to admit, like Congresswoman Eshoo, there were terms that, you know, are just foreign to all of us. Shape files, fabric issues. I mean, these are just not commonly understood terms, and I applaud you, Ms. Bloomfield, acknowledging that you might not know the speed of your internet. Most of us don't really. And so to the extent that you all can just continue to educate the American people, because this is really the issue for the future and for everyone in our country. Indiana, I'm really proud, has made a commitment to broadband build-out on a state program called Next Level Broadband, and we're going to be investing $100 million for broadband in our non-served and underserved areas. Officials involved with those build-outs, though, have told me that we have ongoing problems. We heard this from Scott Rudd, the director of Broadband Opportunities for Lieutenant Governor Crouch, that we're having ongoing problems with households paying for internet service, but then having such restricted access due to network outages. And we haven't really talked about that with the fault, you know, resting on the ISPs. So essentially they don't have internet access. Has there been any discussion in all of this about whether or not to include network outages as part of any criteria for whether a location is served or not in the new proposed mapping regime being pursued? We hear about latency, but what about outages? Has that been discussed at all? And why or why not? Anyone have any answers for that?
Congresswoman, I have not heard any discussion on that in relation to the wireless side of the equation. We certainly have outage reporting obligations to the FCC that we engage in on a regular basis when they're triggered. But I haven't heard, you know, I think as an industry, we try to deliver a service that's relatively reliable, 99.9% of the time. And I don't see that as a big issue on the wireless side.
Anyone else?
Again, I would also say that wireline carriers also have obligations and reporting requirements. As we talk about different things that could be plugged in, you know, adding that as a factor might make sense. Honestly, they have such strict obligations. I'm actually surprised to hear that that's such a big issue in Indiana.
Well, I'd be really interested. Mr. Spalter?
Well,
Did
I'm
you?
sorry, if you needed to complete.
No. Did you have anything
Thank
further?
you, Congresswoman. Well, the really important aspect of the legislation before this committee is that it insists that we move forward before we actually spend federal resources to achieve greater broadband support for unserved communities, that we have a map that's sufficiently granular that shows where served and unserved locations are. That's the location fabric. Once we have that, you can then layer on all kinds of other reporting methodologies. Shapefiles, highly complementary to it. Potentially even reporting of network blockage or network outage moments, as Mr. Stegman just advised me. But what we need to start with, precedentially, if we are going to be good stewards of federal dollars and really close the digital divide, is first do our fundamental work of developing and scaling that location fabric, which shows where the locations that are currently served and takes that next important holy grail step of identifying by the rooftop level where there are unserved locations still in America.
Well, thank you, and if anyone wants to call Scott Rudd, feel free to find out what he's concerned with. I want to thank Mr. Stegman in my remaining time, because in case you are contemplating doing more pilots, Indiana would welcome the opportunity for you to conduct more pilots. But given the issues you said were present in address data, do you have any thoughts on whether or not addresses should be considered served if ISPs don't actually know whether or not they service a specific household or not?
It's a good question. The address level data that we've seen, there's difficulties in tying that address to a point on the Earth's surface and actually identifying your house. Sometimes in rural areas, it just doesn't link up. When you key it in Google or elsewhere, it doesn't line up. So the fabric provides that additional knowledge of where the location is, so you understand if you have access to service or not when you have the maps available.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your work. I yield back.
General Lady yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member, thank you for your continued efforts to improve the accuracy of our national broadband maps. I wish Ms. Eshu was still here. I would publicly associate myself with her remarks, and then Ms. Brooks came along from Indiana, and she aligned herself with Ms. Eshu, and I just want to say that what both of these members have said is critically important. I came on this committee January 3rd of 2007. I guess that's been 12 years now. And every year that I've been on this committee, we've been talking about mapping. And so as Ms. Eshu said, let's just get it done. The data is crucial to understanding which parts of our country still lack adequate broadband infrastructure and sufficient speeds to use the internet effectively. And there are still parts of my district, as my other colleagues have mentioned in their districts, there are still parts of my district in eastern North Carolina that do not have consistent access to reliable broadband, a resource critical to competing in today's economy. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that our maps purporting to identify underserved and unserved areas remain absolutely inaccurate. That's why I was delighted to join Mr. O'Halloran and Ms. Rogers as original co-sponsor of H.R. 3162. Our bill will ensure, Mr. Chairman, that national service data is accurate and will hold providers accountable for the mapping data, shapefiles, if you will, that they submit. It is my hope and belief that this bill and others that we will consider will aid us in bringing the promise of the internet age to all Americans. Let me go to my far left, since I'm most comfortable with that. I'll go. I have friends on the right too. But Ms. Bloomfield, I agree with you that it is important to engage in a challenge process before an agency gives out broadband funding. But how do we strike the right balance, if you will, so that providers and the FCC aren't so overwhelmed by challenges that vital funding gets delayed?
That's an excellent question. It's a balance, and you're always seeking that balance. And I think in part, as you move to more granular maps, you're going to have better maps. So the gap is going to narrow. So you're going to have better information. So you're going to start from that if this bill is enacted, FCC moves forward, the maps will become more granular by definition. So the areas that you're looking to actually do these challenges process in will be more limited. I think, you don't want people to do this on a whim. But I think that, again, the story of what is on the ground is really the sanity check, because you're dealing with self-reported data, so you need to have that reality check of what is actually taking place. I think there is a way to strike that balance, and I think it's going to be an important one. I don't think we're going to see what we saw with the Mobility Fund. I think, again, because better mapping will lead to better data.
All right, Mr. Assey, if I can go to you next, please. I think it's important for the public to be able to provide input on the broadband map so that we get a better sense of really what's happening on the ground. I understand you support both crowdsourcing and a challenge process as a means of getting this done. Could you please talk about how those public input opportunities will create a more accurate broadband map?
Sure, and I would agree with Ms. Bloomfield. We do have to have standards that make sure that we come up with a mechanism that is administratively workable and provides public input that can lead to more accurate maps. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes the people with the best information are the people with boots on the ground, and certainly there's a capability to challenge representations that are made, and this is a process that we can create to hopefully improve the accuracy of the maps we have. We have some experience, at least with respect to grants that have been made for broadband previously in developing a challenge process, and hopefully we can learn from that and developing a process that the general public can participate in as well.
If I may continue with you very briefly, I think it's important for the public, I am an original co-sponsor of the mapping bill introduced by Mr. O'Halloran, and I'd like to go back to your testimony where you talked about the benefits of using shapefiles to map broadband service. As you know, much of my district in North Carolina is rural, so getting the best broadband data in the quickest way possible is important to me and to my constituents. Could you explain how shapefiles can achieve more granular data?
Sure. I think shapefiles will allow network providers to draw boundaries around their service areas based on what they know, based on the places they are, the places their lines run, the places they offer service or can offer service. Right now, we have a reporting mechanism that essentially requires us to report on the basis of presence or absence in a census block. So I think being able to rely on the provider at least as a matter of first instance, to draw the boundaries of where it can serve will lead to more accurate results, and we will be able to refine that over time.
Is this similar to tax mapping? How all of our tax departments have this GIS system. Is it in the same?
I'm sorry, I couldn't tell you.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee for having this hearing and for the witnesses to be here. All I know is that for too long, my constituents in southern rural Michigan have been missing out on the 21st century digital economy due to flawed broadband availability maps. But more importantly, I don't care whether I look at it through a shapefile in the fabric or how granular I get. I can't find broadband at my property. And so I'm left out as well. So it's personal to me. And so I commend the members of the committee here today for offering this legislation and for us debating it. I'm just hoping it works as we move forward with what ought to be. When I first heard about shapefiles, I remember my singing quartet experience of shape notes. I know all about that. But shapefiles I want to learn more about through practical experience. Mr. Spalter, in your testimony, you spoke of how the broadband serviceable location fabric could be the underpinning of as you said, a contemporary, tailored, and updatable broadband map to serve as the foundation for all future spending decisions. I believe we must ensure efforts to improve our maps are not just for the short term. So I think I agree with you on that. How important is it for the fabric to reflect changes in mapping capabilities in the future? And do you have recommendations on how we can improve mapping sources so that the fabric can be constantly improving?
The foundational element of any improvement for future broadband mapping methodologies has to be, again, that location fabric that will be a national data set that shows where locations are served, but also importantly where they are unserved. And once we are able to establish that location data set, and we know that we can do it timely and affordably within a year, then you can dynamically add on all kinds of reporting and complementary reporting methodologies like shapefiles, other types of data sets that will be coming online that will be made available openly in an open source way through state, local, and even municipal data sources, in new innovative proprietary data sources, additional company-led efforts to initiate open source methodologies, for example, like Microsoft's rooftop imagery data sets, which already are incorporated into our location fabric. But it all starts with the need to have a baseline understanding of where our broadband served locations currently are and where they are not. And upon that, then, we can couple all kinds of other reporting methodologies, and we must do so, particularly as we're looking about the opportunity of spending $20 billion in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, 3/4 of which, according to the current design, will be out the door without the benefit of this foundational data set. We need to have a proper sequencing, which is why we support your efforts in this committee, echoing what's gone on in the Senate with similar legislation to move forward to establish this foundational data set.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Assay, it's vital that we obtain more detailed information about where service is and where service is not, so that we can better identify the truly unserved populations. Do you believe incorporating shapefiles will help achieve this goal, and if so, how?
Shapefiles will definitely help us achieve the goal of more accurately identifying households that are unserved. And to the extent we can do that, we can better marshal our resources to fill those gaps.
Well, we hope that's the case, very much so. Ms. Bloomfield, can you talk about how important an ongoing and periodic challenge process is to improving our nation's mapping capabilities?
Absolutely. So as everybody was talking about, whether you go shapefiles, fabric, what sequence you're looking at, again, there's still self-reported data. So at the end of the day, the challenge process is going to be really important because it's your sanity check. It's the one chance to be able to say what's really happening.
Good nomenclature.
So I think it's really critical. And we've seen it work in programs. RUS has a challenge process with some of their awards that they are doing under the Reconnect. It's an important part to make sure that if you've got federal resources that are pretty limited, how do we direct them particularly to the unserved, then start working to the underserved, and then continuing to build and sustain networks. So if we're really going to tackle this as a country and we're really going to be serious about it, we've got to use the resources wisely, and the challenge process will help us do that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Welch for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the committee is finally acting to fix this wildly inaccurate broadband map situation. We've been at it for a number of years, and finally we've got a chairman who's got the gavel that's going to make something happen. Thank you, Mr. Doyle. One of the things that actually is very troubling is in the zeal of the FCC to get out feel-good information, there was no critical assessment of what the reality was for people in rural Vermont or in rural South Dakota or in rural Iowa. And it's pretty outrageous. I just want to say that because there was all this happy talk for years that we've got coverage in all these areas when we didn't. And that was our government really neglecting rural America. And I just want to register my outrage at that because so much of the people we represent need that coverage and don't want to be second-class citizens. So when this Congress says that rural America is going to get equal service, more or less, but then the FCC doesn't stand up to make that happen, it really is not acceptable. Now, having said that, I'm very happy with this panel and with the progress that we now are making. But we've got to follow through on this because it has to be at the end of the day that rural America has the tools it needs in order to survive and compete. And that's a real common thread amongst all of us who represent rural America. But let me just ask a few questions. I'll start with you, Mr. Spellmeyer. We've been talking about the mapping challenges for years now, so it's nice to have a concrete discussion about progress in the committee. Can you share with the committee what your company found when it went around the country and challenged the maps during the Mobility Fund 2 process, and where do we go from here?
Yes, Congressman. The short answer is we found a mess. As I said in my testimony, we spent $2 million. That was a significant investment on our part to hire drive test companies to drive around. I think we covered 16 states. We found more places to challenge than we didn't find, and we submitted a huge number of challenges to the FCC. I think you're right. I've been talking about this issue for a decade. And I actually think it's a good news story of Congress actually working. For a long time, I couldn't get bureaucrats in Washington to pay any attention to this issue. And eventually, it was conversations with members of the Senate and members of the House who all looked at me and said, yeah, you're right, I don't have coverage in my district, that allowed us to raise the profile of this issue and get to where we're at today. And I'm actually really excited that we can pass this bill.
Let's keep going. Ms. Bloomfield, do we have to have a challenge process in place?
I would not go down this road without a challenge process. I think it's really important. You need a verification. If you're going to really take this seriously,
Right.
there's only so much. First of all, I think it's impressive that you've got a panel that includes a lot of provider representatives who are all saying, we want to report, we'll report, but you've got to be able to verify.
Thank you. Mr. Spalter, when we're mapping broadband, do you feel it's important to consider latency and usage limits, or is tracking speed enough?
I think that latency is an important, critical insight that will inform not only the quality of service that ultimately consumers need, but also will help direct our federal broadband support programs to the kinds of technologies that actually can toe the line when it comes to maintaining those standards. We know, particularly, if we want to have a 5G world, we're going to have wireline infrastructure to provide the backhaul, especially in rural America, to make that promise available to those citizens that live in our rural communities.
Thanks.
And the latency requirements need to be eventually part of any assessment of where our broadband dollars are going to be most effective.
Thank you. Ms. Fulberg, you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think that when we're looking at, first of all, the broader digital divide, not just questions of deployment, but questions of competition, questions of affordability, the more information we can get about what this market actually looks like for consumers is going to be immensely valuable for policymakers. Usage limits, for example, can have a huge impact on how a customer uses service, whether or not they have to pay more for that service than they initially signed up for, whether or not they can use that service consistently. So I think especially as we try to use this legislation as a stepping stone and move into talking about the broader digital divide and these competitive issues and affordability issues, these kinds of quality of service metrics should be part of the conversation.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gianforte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for this important discussion today. During our hearing with the FCC commissioners, many members on this committee raised concerns about the accuracy of Form 477 and the FCC coverage maps. The inaccuracy of these maps shows cell phone and broadband coverage in areas of Montana where we have no coverage. This failure reduces USF investment in our most hard-to-reach places, and it could lead to overbuilding in some areas while underbuilding in others. The lack of high-speed broadband coverage and investment has real impacts on hardworking Montana families. I've heard from small business owners who, because they don't have access to reliable cell coverage, just can't conduct business while they travel around the state. Recent FCC reports on broadband deployment claimed that 86% of Montanans had access to high-speed internet service. This is simply not true. Many of the providers I've met with believe that the number is greatly inflated and that access is probably closer to 50%. The FCC even acknowledged its figures aren't correct and has issued fines to companies that have overstated coverage. Recently, we had Commissioner Brendan Carr to Montana. I commend him. He's now traveled to over 30 states to observe locally, to get on the ground. He stated when he was in Montana, Montana has the worst cell phone coverage of any state he's been to so far. I know I can also attest that every Montanan can tell you exactly where on the interstate you're going to lose coverage and how long it's going to take to get it back so you can continue a conversation. That's why I signed on to the Broadband Data Improvement Act. Rather than using large and inaccurate census blocks, Representative Rogers' bill encourages the FCC to use shapefiles in order to give a better idea of where broadband coverage is and, more importantly, where it isn't, so we can invest. I think we should also focus on the challenge process. We've had a lot of discussion on that here today to help smaller co-ops and rural broadband providers challenge coverage maps before funding is dispersed. There's a conversation about using crowdsourced data, which could be informative but not a deciding factor in these accuracy of the maps. It's time to get these maps right so we can invest in those areas that need it most to close this digital divide so that Montanans can have better access and more reliable access to broadband and cell coverage. So, Ms. Bloomfield, it's good to see you again. Thank you for traveling to Montana. It was good to have you there at the Montana Telecom Association event in Big Sky just a couple of weeks ago. We spent a lot of time there talking about mapping and the other challenges Montana's face. I want to drill into this challenge process a little bit. You've talked about it today, the importance, so that our small guys who have actually been, in my mind, better stewards of the USF dollars than some of the larger legacy out-of-state providers who have not invested the way the local people have. Could you just reiterate briefly the importance of the challenge process?
Absolutely. So particularly as we're looking at the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund coming out, Congressman, and again, you know, I knew exactly where, even in Big Sky, and when we joke because it's a resort, you just go a mile down the road and you lose service. You lose actually internet access everywhere. So it is, these programs like Universal Service are going to be really important, and choosing to put those dollars in the areas, and we look at RDOF, it's the opportunity for carriers who are not going to be providing service in those territories to basically say so and allow other providers to come in. To best direct those fundings, we really need to know where those resources can be directed so you can start filling in the gaps in a state like Montana, which has gaps.
Now, we just had some discussion from the prior questioner. Mr. Spalter spoke about the need to consider latency and usage limits in addition to just tracking speed. Could you comment on that further, Ms. Bloomfield?
Absolutely. I think that when we start looking at standards and we start looking at what service really entails, and obviously people think about speed and they think about their experience, but part of the experience really is truly the latency, and it is the ability to be able to do some of the things like Ms. Floberg had talked about, where, you know, when if your access might be tied to a usage, and you've got a kid doing homework, and you've got, you know, data limits, at some point you're really kind of tying the hands of some of your consumers. So making sure that folks actually submit and report that information, it's not onerous to do so, and if we're really going to take this seriously and gather data, we should gather all the data we can.
Great. Well, I just want to reemphasize the need for accurate maps. We do not have accurate maps in Montana, and as a result, the USF dollars, taxpayer money, is just not being invested properly. So thank you for your testimony to that. With that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member, Mr. Latta, for convening this subcommittee hearing today on improving our nation's broadband maps. Broadband has proved to be an equitable instrument to level the playing field for millions of Americans and a necessary step to ensuring the success of our national infrastructure. The use of this technology has the potential to decrease the digital divide so consumers can have access to educational and employment opportunities, and this is no longer a luxury for my constituents. However, fraudulent broadband mapping reporting on broadband access is a barrier to consumers, whether they are from rural America or urban America. These harmful reporting practices skew the data that determines where and how federal dollars are spent. Thus, in a GAO report, it was found that the FCC data overstated broadband deployment by allowing providers to report availability in blocks where they do not have any infrastructure connecting homes to their networks if the providers determined that they could offer service to at least one household. We've heard that. It is incumbent on each member here to ensure that these gaps in broadband coverage are addressed in a manner that will protect the American people and help to close the digital divide across our country. Like our highway system, if you don't make sure that every road is connected, at some point we're going to have catastrophic circumstances and parts of our nation will be left behind. So my first question is actually to Ms. Floberg. Ms. Floberg, can you describe the effect that high prices have on closing the digital divide, and is that a good reason for the FCC to collect pricing data?
I'd say it's an excellent reason for the FCC to collect pricing data. What we've seen is that right now, according to the current FCC Form 477 collection, 141 million people in this country don't subscribe to broadband at the FCC's 25.3 speed threshold. Now, this conversation is a lot about trying to figure out how big of a proportion there don't have access, can't subscribe to that service because it's not available. And that is an important problem. But we still have, conservatively, 100 million people who do have access to 25.3 and they can't subscribe. Or they subscribe to a slower tier because that's the only option they have. They can't afford to get the fast kind of internet that they need. Or again, millions and millions more people who do subscribe, but are constantly having to make sacrifices and to choose what they pay for this month. Can they afford the internet this month, or can they afford food this month? And those kinds of choices are not choices we should be asking people to make. They're not choices that indicate a closed digital divide.
Absolutely, thank you. The FCC's mapping data is utilized for various policy matters, including federal subsidies. Additionally, the data is used to better understand telecom market competition, specifically to review mergers. Mr. Spalter, how is mapping data utilized to justify potential telecom mergers? And how will updating flawed collection methods like Form 477 and broadband maps help improve this process?
I can't speak specifically to how broadband mapping per se can actually improve or accelerate the ability to effectively and incisively evaluate mergers. I'm not an antitrust expert. However, what I do know is that the ability to deliver to policymakers at the FCC, at other agencies of government across the country, a mechanism to more accurately and with specificity pinpoint where our current locations that are served and unserved is the start of an extraordinary range of diverse and innovative reporting and or analytic opportunities that we could layer onto that foundational data set, such as merger reviews, that will actually be able to accelerate good public policy and allow us to maintain really good stewardship of the kinds of dollars that we're committing through public programs.
Very well. I have like 22 seconds left. Would you like? Okay. Let me ask a final question then, and that quickly. Mr. Bloomfield, it is important to improve broadband mapping so that we can identify more precisely where broadband is available, but also to examine the quality. Do you agree that information on quality of service is valuable too? If so, can you expand on the statement?
Absolutely. I think it's a good idea to actually capture performance. But I think, again, when I hear this committee talk about how long it's taken to get mapping done, I would say right now the discussion on the table is also about, like, how do we get the location? How do we get the accuracy in that? I think teeing up for another day, absolutely discussions about, we welcome better visibility into the performance process. So those are also key discussions.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the late gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the testimony of the panel. Representative Lujan, the chairman, and myself have introduced legislation that would provide some accountability to the mapping process. The MAP Improvement Act directs the FCC to engage in standardized information collection and incorporate it into a single map. This seems like common sense to me. The bill also allows for consumers to provide feedback on map accuracy. That makes sense too, since the individual themselves is the ultimate decider of whether coverage exists at their property or not. Mr. Spalter, do you think that that including the intended end user in the coverage map is an important check on map accuracy? And then also, and how would you envision the review process taking shape from the company perspective?
It's not only important, but it's entirely appropriate, Congressman Bilirakis, to facilitate that, not only for federal governments, but for all levels of governments, tribal entities, to be able to actually have that kind of accountability and verifiability that comes with both challenge and verifiability processes. One of the benefits, actually, of advancing in the proper sequence at the front end a location fabric is that it will actually allow us, as Ms. Bloomfield pointed out, to minimize the number of challenges we ultimately are going to have, because we will have a reference point, a national reference point of where locations are and where they're not, against which it will be a lot harder and there will be more disincentives to report inaccurately. So we think that crowdsourcing, keeping this as a living document that can be iterated with the best kinds of products that are out there in the marketplace, every year is an important step, and we support it.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Assey, the FCC is questioning whether it should require more granular data. One complaint from providers for very granular address level service data is that such information could be used as a target for their competitors. Is this a reasonable fear, in your opinion? And if so, what can be done to ensure that the FCC has accurate and reliable data, but also protects sensitive information for their industry, regardless of how granular it is? If you can answer that, appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I mean, obviously there is competitively sensitive data that all companies have about their plans to serve their customers. I do think one of the things that we've achieved through the shapefile process is a real balance. You know, we've talked a lot about granularity, but there's another side, which is you can get so granular that you can create systems that are so complex that they are difficult to execute and update on a regular basis. So one of the reasons we focused on moving from census blocks to shapefiles is because we believe that protects competitively sensitive data, that it is achievable, and that it is extendable across the United States in a very rapid fashion, and that we'll get the most bang for our buck if we focus on that.
Very good, I appreciate that. Anybody want my time? All right, I'll yield back. Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Billarakas. Very quickly, if I may, as you know, Mr. Spellmeyer, our bill, the LADA-Loebsack bill, Loebsack-LADA, however we want to say it, has some specific parameters to change how mobile broadband internet access is documented. And can you explain how and why these prescribed parameters will improve the maps that we have now?
Yes, Congressman. I do believe they will significantly improve the map. There's a number of additions specified by the legislation. The two most important ones relate to when we model these networks and how the signal propagates, you have to make a choice about something called cell edge probability. What's the probability that that signal is actually going to get out to the cell edge? The FCC used 80%. We don't think that's a commercially reasonable number. Taking it up to 90 is consistent with how we engineer our networks. The other big one was cell loading. The FCC said model a network loaded at 30%. We don't think that's accurate, and this one bumps it up to 50. Much more balanced picture.
All right, thank you, and thank you again, Mr. Billarakas, for yielding. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Vesey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, in urban America, which I represent, we have sort of two, different issues. You have, like myself, for instance, right, where I have one MVPD provider, and then I have a different ISP because I don't necessarily have the highest speed in my area, so I have to have two different services so I can have the highest speed. But there are still some areas in urban America where there is no coverage. And so I wanted to maybe ask Ms. Floberg, when they were, looking into this issue, did you think that the shape files that have been proposed will also be able to accurately show where there are underserved areas in urban America that may still need coverage, especially when you take into consideration that the $20.4 billion that was used for existing universal payout to ISPs to be able to provide coverage to rural areas were really, I think, specified just for rural America. And so do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, I think that the promise of greater granularity here is most relevant when we're talking about these larger rural census blocks, but is absolutely valuable and I think has the potential to help highlight where there might be particular neighborhoods in urban areas that are being overlooked when it comes to deploying faster and faster speeds. I think that definitely can, the level of granularity promised could hopefully highlight some of those areas and help us figure out if there are cases where we have examples of digital redlining occurring.
Yeah. And with the FCC's different proposals, and I'll be happy for anybody to answer this, with some of the proposals that have been out there, like digital opportunity data collection, crowdsourcing, sunsetting Form 477. Is there something that should have also been included that wasn't a part of that initial FCC proposal that could really help people in underserved areas?
I can jump in on that again. I mean, I think that part of this, again, that we think is really important, and this may not be for this bill in this day, but expanding our understanding of the digital divide and trying to expand that to understanding prices, trying to understand what kinds of prices consumers are actually being charged. Right now, this is something where the FCC currently collects virtually zero useful data in trying to gauge what those prices are nationwide, which makes it very hard to say where broadband might be affordable, where it's not, or even for policymakers to assess what kinds of interventions might be necessary.
I would just add that I do think that we're in a really interesting sweet spot where with what you all are doing in the legislation that you have bipartisanly written through this committee and have discussed, aligned with what the FCC's current action is really all moving on the right track at the same time. So I think there's some really interesting momentum that we don't always see here in Washington, D.C. to actually take care of the mapping issue. So I just applaud all of you for that, and again, the coordination with the FCC.
Congress, we are literally on the precipice of being able to stick the landing on national bipartisan legislation, coupled with the important work that our colleagues at the FCC are doing to advance the idea that we can have a national broadband map. And once we accomplish that goal, there will be innumerable ways to catalyze additional insight, analytics, reporting, and other elements that will speak to exactly the issue that you're driving, which is how can we better support all Americans in rural communities, exurban, suburban, and urban communities as well, to realize the power and potential of broadband and make it more equitable.
Yeah. And if I could just ask with the remainder of my time, just one very hypothetical question. So if a company were able to deploy low Earth orbit satellites to provide coverage in these gaps that we've talked about today, would current providers, would there still be the need on the ground from people represented here today and others to still sort of fill in these gaps?
I'd offer on behalf of the wireless industry that I'm not certain that those low Earth orbit satellites are going to deliver a mobile product that will be sustainable, inside an automobile at 70 miles an hour.
Interesting. Okay.
Many of our companies at U.S. Telecom are advancing creative ways of partnering with certain satellite communities to reach last mile geographies to ensure that there could be potential service. But we actually have to be very, very careful that we are prioritizing spending federal resources for broadband deployment that can actually be sustainable and can help rural communities achieve benefits of things like 5G and other next generation technologies through wireline technology access that's just not going to be available through platforms like satellite.
Okay. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion before the public on this very important issue. And it's something that unfortunately the American public doesn't understand how important it is and how, how directly affected they are, because everybody is somehow, some way connected to one of these. And so I have a question, Ms. Bloomfield. Why do you think a challenge process is necessary, even if the maps are more granular?
So I think the granular maps is a really good start, and I think the challenge process really allows us to make sure we've got integrity in the program. Again, particularly when you're talking about either federal support of some way, whether it's universal service or it's Reconnect through USDA or Community Connect programs, any of these programs, or when you're thinking about a policy change. So I think, again, it's that opportunity, and I don't want to repeat myself, but to do the sanity check, to be the validation process at the back end. So you've got the process in the front end with the mapping and the standards and all of those pieces. It's the ability to do the validation on the back end to make sure that the information you have is what you were told you had.
Okay. Also, Ms. Bloomfield, when mapping broadband, why is it important to consider latency and usage limits? Isn't tracking speed enough?
So I think, again, we go back to what is the consumer, what are they going through? We know, I represent small community-based telecommunication providers. The number of folks that actually have poor service a lot of times is because they bought their router on eBay. So there's a lot of different things that we need to be looking at, but really when you're thinking about, particularly as we move forward, and particularly as the Internet of Things becomes a bigger part of our life and our economy, we need to make sure that folks are getting service that is in real time and that they are not stymied by usage caps that might impact the affordability of the product that they're receiving.
Okay, thank you. And then also to Mr. Assey, we agree we want to create these maps as soon as possible. How do you imagine the agencies will coordinate to get this done?
Well, we've taken a giant step in August with the adoption of the order directing providers to move to shapefile reporting. I think we're working with USAC and waiting on guidance for some of the standards that are going to be required for that. But I think we are well on our way.
Okay, and the coordination, is that healthy?
It's absolutely essential, and it's one of the things that we're very gratified that the committee is considering putting its mark in encouraging that type of coordination. I do think that the best thing that will encourage that coordination is actually the success of getting a better map, because then agencies will be incented to want to use that map and for everyone to be singing off the same sheet of music.
Okay, better map. Who wins if we don't have better mapping?
Certainly not rural America, certainly not the many, many hundreds of thousands of enterprises and individuals and families and communities that still are in unserved community that are considered to be served. Certainly not the public treasury, our fiduciary duty to use funds that are available through our taxpayers to their best and highest purpose. If we're not doing the right work on getting our maps right at the front end, I will assure you, through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or any other future broadband support program, if we do not have this granular location fabric to start, we will be misapplying public funds, and that would be a shame.
Does this have a positive effect when it comes to public safety, healthcare, things of that nature? Because now this is being integrated in every walk of life. It's not just out of convenience, for convenience tools, talking on the phone with your friend or what have you. We're talking about this is, directly affecting people's ability to respond in emergency situations, et cetera, correct?
The growth of one of the most epidemic medical chronic conditions in America is diabetes. And unfortunately, many of those who are suffering from that condition live in remote, rural communities. If we are denying the ability to make sure we're pinpointing accurately the resources that we need to get to those communities through inspired by the legislation that's before us, we will be not serving not only broadband, but not serving the health of Americans.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just have a few seconds to take a point of personal privilege to thank my colleagues who are continuing to focus on these issues and introducing these bills, and for us to have this dialogue and debate about what the proper paths going forward, even though that on many occasions, many of our talented staff are stolen to the private industry, et cetera. We're still capable and we're still getting the job done. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Who did that?
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you allowing me to wave onto the committee today and join you all in this important discussion. As technology becomes increasingly integrated into every aspect of our lives, our economy, our society, it's more important than ever to ensure that all Americans, especially those in the rural areas, have access to high-speed and internet connection. Coming from Eastern Washington, living in Eastern Washington, now representing Eastern Washington in Congress, in too many of the areas that I drive when getting around the district and visiting various communities, coverage has remained static. I was reminded of it earlier this year. I was in a couple of communities just south of Spokane. Spokane is the second largest city in Washington State, and I was just 15, 20 miles south of Spokane in Rockford and Fairfield, and they had nothing. So there's a growing and growing drumbeat that, you know, this needs to be a priority, and I join in that because whether it is economic development, whether it's healthcare, telehealth, so much of the future of healthcare is around telehealth, education. Our kids are doing more and more homework online and personalized education, you know, or healthcare. It is our future. So in August, I hosted a couple of roundtable discussions in Eastern Washington, one in Colville, which is more north of Spokane, 70 miles north, and then one in Pomeroy that is even further south. And it was good. It was good to bring the community together, the elected officials, the ISPs, others, business owners, healthcare providers that are involved in trying to solve this issue in Eastern Washington. One of the main barriers that seems to be common right now is ensuring that we have the accurate maps. And that this is so important as we have this discussion about how are we going to ensure that every area is covered. Earlier this year, I joined with Mr. O'Halloran in introducing the Broadband Data Improvement Act. And it's one of several bipartisan bills that we're considering here today. And this bill tackles the inaccurate mapping on several fronts. One, by increasing the granularity of provider-reported data using shapefiles. Two, by utilizing a three-pronged validation process, including the use of third-party data and an on-the-ground accuracy verification. And third, ensuring a robust challenge process. Those are the three main areas. It also provides assistance to smaller providers to minimize the burden of the reporting requirements. And I just want to thank all of the witnesses today for being here today and for your work to improve broadband access for all Americans. I'm encouraged by the variety and the priority that this committee is making to move forward in a bipartisan way so that we can ensure that the limited federal funds that we do have, but that we have been prioritizing for this effort, reach the areas where the need is the most. I wanted to ask if you could talk just a little bit more about the importance of having a robust validation and challenge process to ensure the accuracy of our broadband maps, in addition to increasing granularity. And specifically, what role should third-party data play in this process? And Ms. Bloomfield, I wanted to ask you that. Then open it up.
So first of all, thank you so much for your leadership. It has been very key, and as you listed the key points in your legislation, they're all things that we absolutely endorse and support and think are important. So when you talk about validation, you know, there's a lot of different ways to do it. You know, one of the things we've all talked about as a panel has been how do you incorporate things like crowdsourcing? How do you actually gather that information from people served on the ground? I think that's a really interesting and intriguing idea. I would just say, though, that again, what you don't want to do is create a process that becomes really a burden where somebody has to chase down every complaint and respond, and how do we actually capture trends so that we don't get bogged down in that process and we can continue to move forward to make sure that the maps are accurate and people can continue to spend more of their time and energy actually building the broadband than reporting back through that process. So I think it's important, but I think it has to be done very thoughtfully. But again, I think that along with a challenge process, so at the back end you can actually really do that verification, is going to be very significant.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I would add, so I think a challenge process is vital. The FCC did a one-time data collection, and if we hadn't had a challenge process there, those maps that show all of Eastern Washington as covered would have been locked into place and used by the FCC. On the wireless side, we used shape files to build that last map, but without a challenge process to go out and test it, we would have been stuck in a real mess. So the good news is that all of the legislation in front of us puts us in the right direction to fix it once and for all.
Okay, our time has expired. I thank the gentlelady. Chair requests unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A letter from the Western Governors Association, a letter from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Without objection, so ordered. Let me thank all the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. You've been a most excellent panel, and we've enjoyed hearing from you. I want to remind all members that pursuant to the committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared, and I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. At this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.